The Nocturnals arrive this Christmas. Site 12, December 23rd, 2021. I walk through the Site 12 facility, which had been sparsely decorated with a bunch of Christmas-themed trinkets. It wasn't much, a fake tree here and some lights there, but it's damn sure more than you would have gotten under Ted Bowser's management. The guy was like a real-life Scrooge. He thought Christmas time always took away productivity in our operations. Go figure. Nonetheless, I make it to the room I'm looking for. The office of the current director of operations, Jennifer White. "You wanted to see me?" I asked, poking my head inside as Jennifer sat at her desk, staring at piles of paperwork. "I did. Come on in, Ron," she replies, sounding a bit less cold than usual. "Sounds like you're feeling good? Holiday season cheering you up?" I joke, prompting her to nod her head sarcastically. Maybe it would if I wasn't in here 12 hours a day. But anyway, "I got something for you," she proclaims, reaching under the desk and retrieving a black binder without any markings or labels on it. After opening it up, she turns it around, allowing me to see the contents within, one of which was a picture I recognized, a picture that she had shown me months back after a data recovery mission to a certain bottomless lake, a long story for another time. The surrounding environment depicted in the photo was what looked to be a dark basement with rusted pipes running along the walls and ceiling. At the end of the room were multiple dark, pitch-black and shadowy human figures with pairs of glowing red dots where their eyes should have been. The Nocturnals. "You, showed me this one before." I posizye. "I know, but it's become relevant again. You see, there's been more than 7 reports of missing person cases lately," she states matter-of-factly. "Well, that seems pretty standard to hear about in this job. Not when all of these said missing people have all disappeared from one building in a matter of days." I raise an eyebrow, now genuinely curious about what she was referring to. The Landerson Mall, it closed down just a few days ago to avoid any more incidents. Only us and the federal government are aware of the true details. Even the local police are in the dark about the truth. She pauses for a second. "Anyway, from what my superiors have shown me, the Nocturnals are the ones to blame." "What exactly did they show you?" "I can't share most of it with you, but there is a video that was posted to the internet by a friend of one of the missing people. We had the IT team scrub all traces of it from the web before it gained any notable traction, but I'm sure it's still out there somewhere. I'm going to have you help me present this in the pre-mission briefing." Jennifer then moves her mouse around as she stares at her monitor, clicking on a few things and then reaching over and turning the monitor so the screen is facing me, which displayed an MP4 video file in the process of being opened. After said file finishes loading, it expands into a video player display, but the actual footage was in the center of the screen in a rectangular formation, giving away the fact that it had been recorded on a smartphone, which is about what I expected. The location depicted in the footage was the parking lot of the mall, filled to the brim with cars, yet seemingly empty when it came to any actual people. The night sky left an ominous darkness over the area. The person recording, who I deduced to be male, was huffing intensely, like he just got done running a marathon. He gets to the end of the mall's parking lot, with the camera now looking out onto the empty highway. It then suddenly shifts 180 degrees, now back to focusing on the mall and parking lot. In between some of the parked cars were the Nocturnals. They stood there, staring at the camera ominously with their red glowing eyes. What are you people? What did you do to Katie?" shouts the supposed cameraman. But he gets nothing in response except the continuous and unsettling stares of the Nocturnals that were sizing him up. The cameraman then begins to swear and curse frantically, the camera movements now becoming shaky and unstable, as the Nocturnals begin to slowly move forward, right in the direction of the cameraman himself. "This is not your hour, Lenoir. came a supernaturally distorted mix of voices, all of them unifying to make one booming and echo-heavy speech. The cameraman then shrieks, and the camera then shifts toward the highway once again as it suddenly starts to become larger in the frame, indicating the cameraman moving toward it at high speed. This only lasted for a few seconds before the video abruptly cut off, leaving the screen drenched in black. All right, I'm going to go ahead and take a wild guess that these things can't be taken down with bullets or grenades, I remarked, much to Jennifer's annoyance. No. Listen, I haven't had to deal with these things before. Last time this particular site did was under Ted. Now, if all the information from the mission report files is true, light-based weaponry will be effective in taking these things down. We tried contacting Isabella Davis for extra help as well, but it seems as if she's gone rogue. Who is that exactly? It's a bit hard to explain in a way that sounds logical, but she was a former agent with us, and according to some old paperwork, there were some classified tests and experiments done on her during a time where the nocturnals were a bit more of an issue for previous leadership. To keep a long story short, she became one of them and inherited all of their abilities, while also retaining her human consciousness and thought process. I exhaled, letting all the information sink in for a few moments. Sounds like some pretty sensitive info. Can I ask why you're sharing it with me? This isn't how our usual meetings go. Jennifer smirks, which again is unlike her, but then she cups her hands together, placing them on her desk and taking a deep breath. Well, I've been authorized to give you a promotion, Ron, to Assistant Director of Operations, but I will only do it on the basis that this mission is successful. You've proven yourself useful over all the years you've been with the agency, and while you and I have only been personally working together for a short time, your file is impressive, and plus, it'll look good to my bosses as well, training and acquiring new leadership. It's been a while since a site in this zone has had an assistant DO. I sat there in silence at first, unsure of how to take such a revelation. I had been so invested in my position as a mission supervisor that I hadn't taken the time to consider anything higher. After everything from battling a ruthless Subject 16A in another universe to taking on creatures at a bottomless lake, any plans to climb my way up the ladder hadn't been seriously pondered. If I go up, who replaces me? I ask. That would be Agent Alex. He was only 15 when he was first recruited over at Site 7. He's going to be transferring here in a few months. But due to staffing shortages, he's going to be here for the next few days in order to help us out. He's got a bit of an unusual past, but the less said on that for now, the better. I'll be honest when I say those last two sentences piqued my curiosity, but I didn't want to push my luck with how good a mood Jennifer was in by probing her about it. Can I have some time to think it over after the mission? Yes, Jennifer retorts, but I need an answer from you in writing within the next 2 weeks. Otherwise, my supervisors will force me to revoke the offer. Fair enough, I reply without much flair. The rest of the day goes as usual. We gathered the team and prepared all the material needed for the briefing. Jennifer filled me in personally on a few more pieces of information that I was meant to keep under wraps and not reveal to the rest of the team. I also went ahead and combed through all the files and paperwork that Jennifer authorized me to regarding the nocturnals, and it was pretty much what I expected. They can control darkness, they convert regular humans into a nocturnal if they catch them, yada yada yada. The next day, Jennifer and I led the briefing to Agents Alex, Carter, Melody, Terrence, and finally Garrett. Nothing occurred that was very different than a typical mission briefing. But afterward, we all loaded up supplies on the transport truck and headed out to the mall, even without them saying anything. There was an obvious disconnect between Carter, Garrett, and Alex. While Carter and Garrett were apparently childhood friends from what I heard, Alex was sort of the odd one out, on a personal level at least. If we can survive the ground grabber, we can survive some angry shadows, blurted Garrett, prompting a shared chuckle between him and Carter. "The hell is a ground grabber?" Alex grilled, looking at the other two men with genuine confusion. "Something we dealt with as kids, before we joined. Or were forced to anyway." Carter replied, "So, this ground grabber did what exactly? Just hid underneath floors or something? Snatched you up through your brand new wood tiles?" Alex rebuts sarcastically. "What exactly got you in here, Mr. Tough Guy?" Garrett interrogated. "Something that would make the both of you crap your pants and tuck your tails between your legs." "Hey," I snap, causing the three of them to go silent. "That's enough. It's almost Christmas, so let's cool it with the arguing." In all honesty, part of me was glad I had an excuse to end their juvenile bickering. But luckily, there weren't any more incidents on the way, as we arrived at the location just minutes later. It wasn't far from Site 12 at all. We all made sure our gear was loaded up and ready to go. After exiting the transport truck, I and the rest of the team noticed the highway on which we had come down was eerily empty, which was definitely alarming considering it was just before Christmas Eve. "Not a car in sight," Alex blurts as he grips his weapon, that being a specially designed giant flashlight that weighed over 15 pounds. We pretty much had to carry the things like they were miniguns. They were powerful enough to light up a football field, and a half when you turned the adjustable knob all the way up, the brightness level was more than enough to blind a man, and then some. A big change of pace from the typical firearms and weaponry we usually brought along on operations. "Treat that thing like a gun when it comes to pointing it at people," Melody informs Garrett. "Even on the lowest setting, it's enough to cause temporary blindness for up to 48 hours, if the beam makes direct contact with your eyes." "Noted," Garrett rebuts, seemingly unfazed by what she had just said. "I'd take it seriously if I were you guys," Terrence interjects. "We can't afford one of you losing a vital sense on an operation like this. Because you know what that means." Carter and Garrett both roll their eyes, prompting an unfriendly glance from Alex. "I'll make sure to be careful," he says, giving Melody, Terrence, and I a nod of respectful acknowledgement, earning him a look of confusion from both Garrett and Carter. "All right, let's move forward. Keep your lights off for now. Do not turn them on until I give the okay. Understood?" I grilled. Everyone gave me a nod in response. So I had us all form up and begin moving into the parking lot of the mall. It looked pretty much identical to how it did in the video footage, with a much more noticeable lack of vehicles present, which made sense, seeing as it had been closed for days now to avoid any more potential incidents. I'm sure the place was already drowning in lawsuits. Jennifer had told me a few of the people who had gone missing inside the mall were kids, so it's safe to say there were going to be some upset parents. It was eerily quiet in the parking lot, like the kind of quiet people warn you about when you're in a forest, you know? The whole, if you're in the woods and everything goes silent, it means there is a predator nearby kind of thing. But in a place like this, with a parking lot that was only a few dozen feet from a main highway, something clearly didn't add up. I knew we weren't alone, and that it was only a matter of when the nocturnals would reveal themselves. I figured that for now, it would be best to let Jennifer and company know we had arrived without incident. "This is Agent Ron. We've made it to the location. So far, no signs of any cryptid activity have been detected." "Got it. Just keep moving and keep us posted," Jennifer replied as my radio crackled to life. Usually on these missions, we possessed visor cameras that would allow whoever was back at the site to see what would we could see through a live video feed. But Jennifer had informed me that we would have to go without them this time and stick with just radios, due to the fact that there had been too many instances of the nocturnals manipulating and destroying visual equipment specifically. Thus, it was deemed as a loss risk, and those things weren't exactly cheap to keep acquiring. I'm surprised the kid in the video even managed to get his footage online after he escaped. About halfway through the parking lot, I froze, noticing something that caught my eye off in the distance. I squinted and leaned forward, and it quickly became clear as to what it was. Between the gap of a parked green sedan and a black SUV were two red glowing circles about the size of golf balls that pierced through the darkness. And due to the source of said circles being right in front of a black object, they gave off the appearance like they were floating. "Stop, all of you," I whisper shouted to the rest of the team, prompting them to seize movement as they laid eyes upon the same thing. I kept my eyes focused on the dots while radioing to Jennifer. "Activity spotted, one at least. There's probably more in the area that we haven't seen yet." "Be careful," she replies. "There's most likely more. Make sure the team stays on high alert." I grip my light, getting my finger ready on the brightness adjustment slider as I feel a tap on my shoulder, only to turn around and find Carter kneeling there with a look of terror on his face. "Hey, boss man, might want to take a look behind us," he says, his tone urgent but hushed. And I do exactly that. Turning around to find our group surrounded and being looked upon by several of the nocturnals, with some being a few dozen feet behind us, and another handful being at each of our sides at about the same distance away. They stared us all down, their glowing red eyes fixated on our every move. None of them inched forward to attack. Not yet, anyway. I turned my head to the rest of the team, all of them harboring expressions of extreme concern. "Get your lights ready, but don't turn them on just yet. We need to wait for the right moment. If we get too aggressive right off the bat, they'll come at us all at once," I whispered, signaling for everyone to calmly and quietly get into a circle formation, taking extra caution to make sure we didn't set these things off. They were intelligent and powerful creatures. Their ability to work in unison and add their victims to their ranks was unlike anything I had encountered in the past beforehand. These beings were the first in a long time to truly terrify me, and I had only been in direct contact with them for a matter of minutes. But possessing the knowledge I didn't help to comfort me. I knew right off the bat that this mission would be a test of my leadership abilities. After another several seconds of the standoff between us and the nocturnals, 3 of them from behind began to levitate and float toward us, their menacing shadow bodies cutting through the wind in a horrifically elegant way. The person facing this particular group most directly was Melody, who raised her light with a forceful grunt and reached over to the adjustment slider and dragged it forward, the light explosively bursting out and illuminating nearly everything in her field of view. Her attackers, without an audible cry, moan, or any other verbal sign of agony, shudder, and immediately retreat backward at the sudden extreme illumination, demonstrating that the lights were just as effective as predicted. All of us had shit-eating grins on our faces, as for once. We felt in control on one of these missions. It was a euphoria that was nice, but wouldn't last for very long. Suddenly, all the surrounding nocturnals begin to close in on us, slowly levitating forward just as the other ones had, floating toward us in this chillingly relentless manner, like they were just ghostly terminators. "Alex, Carter, keep your lights off. Garrett, Terrence, and I will switch mine on," I shouted, as there was no longer a reason to keep quiet. "What? Why?" Carter blurted, prompting me to give him a stern look. "We can't overdo it and risk hurting our own eyes," I rebutted with a slight snarl. Terrence, Garrett, Carter, and I all switched our lights on, the combined power of the brightness and light blue hue of it all drowning the parking lot, and by extension, the nocturnals, in this almost beautiful, ocean-like wave of light. The nocturnals that had come too close were simply disintegrated. It was like watching water evaporate, and there was nothing more of them when they went. Their form simply being erased, never to be seen again. "Never had it this easy before," Terrence cheers. A smirk formed on his face as he took one step forward with his light in hand. "Easy," I called out, We gotta make sure we stay in formation. We got this, boss man. Look, Carter adds. At this point, we had almost cleared the entire parking lot. With a few more good waves of our lights and simply standing our ground, we maintained control of the situation. The few remaining nocturnals all staying put, not wanting to suffer the same fate as their shadowy comrades. So in turn, Terrence was right. But it wasn't like him to get cocky, and it worried me. Meanwhile, we still had to go inside and clear out the actual mall itself. Jennifer had informed me that in order to get rid of a nocturnal infestation, if you will, you need to either destroy the building they were residing in and near itself, or kill every single nocturnal in the area, which would seem nearly impossible, but with these things, it was much more realistic. But that wasn't to say they weren't still dangerous. They were, no matter how much firepower we had against them. The few nocturnals who had survived the initial encounter retreated into the darkness of the surrounding area, presumably heading back to the mall to regroup with all the other ones inside. Once I had assessed that the coast was clear, I turned my attention back to the team. "Lights off, guys," I announce, prompting everyone who the command applied to reach down and adjust their sliders and switch their lights off, leaving the parking lot once again back in an eerie, dim light. Nothing but the few lights that were still on inside of the mall illuminating our path. "All right," I began. "It seems like we've cleared them out for now, but there will be plenty more. Make sure you all keep your heads on straight and don't get cocky. We still don't know the full potential of what these things are capable of, so let's move on and head inside." After my little announcement, I radioed back to Jennifer and informed her of what went down. She seemed to be genuinely enthusiastic, going on a whole positive tangent about how all the money spent on upgrading the light weapons seemed to be paying off. We all pressed forward as a group. I had the younger guys keep an eye on our surroundings, while Terrence, Melody, and I maintained a straight line of sight. Every single angle was worth watching when you were up against something like this. Looking up toward the second-floor windows of the mall, I could see that they were suddenly drenched in darkness that was only alleviated by the glowing red eyes of the nocturnals that stood on the other side, staring our group down with a malicious gaze. I counted up all the pairs of eyes to see how many were just in the windows alone. It came out to just over a dozen when I was finished, which wasn't much more than we had taken out in the parking lot. Difference is, we were in a much less confined space than we would be in there. One of us could easily get cornered or caught off guard if they weren't paying attention. We made it to the outside portion of the main entrance into the mall. I scanned the building now that I was up close, for the most part. It was in decent shape, other than some noticeable cracks and dents in the building material, which was to be expected. It wasn't a very old building, and it had only been neglected for a matter of a few days. All right, this is where we really have to watch our backs. We're going right into the nest, and if we don't coordinate and follow orders, then it could end badly for all of us, I say, getting the team's attention on me as I radioed back to Jennifer. "We can take these things. It'll be a piece of cake." Alex speaks up, attempting to boost morale, but his efforts seem to turn Garrett's expression sour. "Yeah, stroke your ego a little harder while you're at it," he mutters under his breath, prompting Alex to snap his head around. "What's your problem?" Alex grills, keeping calm as he proposed the question. "Both of you, knock it off. I don't want to have to say it again." I snarl, giving them a look that told them I was in no mood to deal with it any further. But before another word could be uttered, a thunderous, metallic-sounding slam erupted from within the interior of the mall, prompting all of us to quickly refocus our attention to where it should have been in the first place. The lights on this first level of the building were still on, but dimly so, which struck me as odd. I thought about why the nocturnals would allow them to remain in working condition like this, unless it was a trap. "Like I said, eyes up," I asserted, just before beginning to lead the team inside. We began at the food court area of the interior. All the vacant restaurants inside felt eerie and desolate, while the main area of the court itself gave off a similar, lifeless, and liminal vibe. It wasn't dilapidated by any means, but that somehow made me more uneasy. It was all clean and maintained enough to not look abandoned, but still unnervingly empty. It wasn't usually a feeling I experienced on these operations, but regardless of this newfound kind of distress, I had to keep leading us forward. I wanted just one mission where we all make it out alive. We scoped out the food court, and each took a peek into some of the restaurants, seeing what had been left behind in the wake of the sudden shutdown. I hadn't discovered anything notable, just a couple of phones, wallets, and other things that had been left behind or lost. "Update me on your status." Jennifer radios in suddenly. "None of them in sight. We're just scoping out the food court for now. Gonna head up to the second floor to terminate the ones up there within the next 10 minutes. I reply, my tone softening as my attention gets grabbed by something else. "Keep moving, we don't have much time." Jennifer retorts in a no-nonsense fashion. I laid eyes on a notebook that was sitting on top of one of the restaurant's counters. It looked rather worn down. Even from the distance I had been standing at, I could tell it had been used frequently. My first thought was to assume it was just used by the business as a method of record keeping. But when I walked over, picked it up, and looked at the contents inside, I was given a very different answer. As I said, it was a notebook, but one that was being used as a journal, seemingly by one of the employees who had worked here. Entry 1, December 15th, 2021, 1 p.m. Mike called me in today. Not usually one for working on my days off, but whatever. I'll be getting Christmas off anyway. Was supposed to go to the gym this morning and I didn't, and now the regret is already setting in. I'm gonna get out of this job one day and finally get started on that novel. Like Dad always said, it ain't gonna write itself. Gonna try and work up the courage to ask out Laura. Everyone always says to never romantically engage with people you work with, but it's not like this job is gonna be my career or anything. Plus, the worst thing she can do is say no. December 15th, 2021, 3:42 p.m. All right, first break of the night. Things are relatively slow. Guess there must be a problem with the power in the back room. The lights keep flickering and it's really weird. And I don't know if I'm just losing my mind or whatever, but it's almost like there's a pattern to it. Whatever. Probably just looking too deep into it. Mike said he's gonna have to stay to close down with us. Had a couple of call-offs. He's a decent boss at the end of the day, so I don't really mind. But something seems like it's been getting to him recently. I went into the office to let him know I showed up for my shift, and the lights were off, and he got a little irritated when I turned them on. Says he can't stand anything too bright at the moment, but he won't tell anyone why. December 15th, 2021, 9:15 p.m. Closing down wasn't as hard as I thought it would be, but something had apparently spooked Laura real bad when she turned the lights off in the walk-in cooler. Told me she could have sworn something was watching her while she was in there. I just think she's had a long day, plus, she's always come off as a nervous person in all honesty. It's kinda cute in a way. That came off a bit more creepy now that I reread it. December 15th, 2021, 11:22 p.m. All right. Now I'm a little on edge. Just ended up getting a call from work. Which would obviously be fine, if it wasn't for the fact that not only was the restaurant closed, but the entire mall. No one was inside the building to be able to make the call. I didn't pick it up and just let it ring. I didn't get a second call, luckily, which I thought would make me feel better. But something just isn't sitting right. Gonna try and go to bed. Maybe a good night's sleep will help me relax a bit. December 16th, 2021, 1:07 a.m. I could have sworn that I heard something downstairs, texted Dad to check it out. Says he didn't see anything wrong, which just doesn't make sense. I know what I heard, and I know that I'm not crazy or anything. Every part of me is telling myself that there's something wrong, but if nothing is truly there, then what can I do? Maybe I really do just need to go to bed after all. December 16th, 2021, 4:22 a.m. It's late. I'm exhausted, can barely even keep my eyes open as I write this, but I need to write this down, what I saw in my nightmare. At least I'm hoping that's all it was. It felt so real, so vivid. I was in the middle of a pine forest. It was nighttime. When I looked up at the sky, the moon appeared bright, but it didn't help how dark it was immediately surrounding me. I could only see trees and dirt that went on into a black void. The idea of being utterly alone, especially in the woods, always freaked me out. But this was something else. I couldn't see anything, or at least dream I couldn't anyway, but I was fully aware that no one was coming to help me, and that only made it much, much worse. I tried walking forward to get a bearing on my surroundings, but there wasn't anything else other than what I had seen before: dirt, trees, and darkness. All I was doing was getting myself more lost, but I had to move. I had to do something. I couldn't just stand there like a sitting duck. Soon enough, whatever presence was with me made itself known. There wasn't a rustling of bushes or the snapping of branches, nothing like that. But I heard a voice project itself from behind me, a low, distorted one that just barely sounded human if you tried hard enough to hear that part. "This is not your hour, Julius," it says, causing me to quickly snap around. But when I finished my 180, there wasn't anything there. So I spun back around to the direction I was looking in to begin with, and I nearly fell over when I saw him, or whatever it was. All I knew is that it wasn't no man. It couldn't have been. Well, it maybe had the shape of one, but that's where any normal human features about it stopped. It was like a man's shadow had grown a mind of its own and separated from him. A shadow man with red eyes. And oh, those eyes. Those red, piercing eyes. They were as bright as frickin' traffic lights, staring me down like I was prey. Which in essence, I guess I was. I spun my head around, and more of them appeared. They just came out of nowhere, all surrounding me and probably preparing to close in. They repeated that same phrase, "This is not your hour, Julius." And all their voices combined together was horrible, a whole bunch of busted microphones all put together to make one horrific sounding call. Then they suddenly started flying over in my direction. And I mean flying. I just stood there, doing nothing as they got close. Once they were within range to grab me, they did. And that's when I woke up. My eyes were wide with terror, and I almost yelped like a frightened puppy before quickly cutting myself off. Who knows how pissed Dad would have gotten at me for waking him up a second time in one night. December 16th, 2021, 12:45 p.m. About to start my shift. Just needed to relax a bit in the break room before I clock in. Still thinking about that dream last night. Am I overthinking or freaking out too much? I don't know. Maybe I am just a wuss at the end of the day. Was hoping to talk to Laura to brighten up my shift a bit, but according to my coworkers, she no show no called today. Gonna just try and focus on the tasks at hand tonight and not let myself get too in my own head. December 16th, 2021, 8:52 p.m. I don't know how to say this, but one of those things from my dream. It was here. I saw it, and I know that it was real. It was frickin' real. I think it's still inside the walk-in cooler. Told our acting manager to head inside there because I thought I saw some leakage. And he said there wasn't anything wrong. I think these things might be hunting me. Why are they coming after me? What did I do to deserve this? If you find this, whoever you are, please help me. And that was it. The end of the journal. Poor Julius. The ending made his fate pretty clear. He joined the ranks of the nocturnals. Hell, he may have been one of the ones we encountered out in the parking lot. What did you find? Terrence asks, approaching me from behind. I hesitate for a second, just before turning to look at him with a blank expression, trying to hide how disturbed I actually was. Figured it was better to keep that to myself just for the sake of morale. Just another piece of evidence. Keep a hold of this and make sure we get it back to Jennifer. She'll want to take a look. Will do. You okay? Seem a little dead. And more than usual. He jokes, seeing through my facade. I'll be fine. Let's just keep going. Get this done, and get the hell out of here. When we regrouped, it appeared at first I was the only one who had found anything of true significance that was also of use. The next in line to me in that regard was Alex, who had seemingly discovered what looked to be a cracked disc, with the words "Shadow Walkers" written on it in a black marker, making it obvious what it most likely contained. Found this in the office of the Brightburger over there, was stuck midway in the disk tray of the computer. Think it might give us something else to work off of. I take the disc from him as he hands it to me, looking at in close detail for a couple of seconds before sliding it underneath the strap in my utility belt. We'll let Jennifer and the guys back at base have a look at it when we return, I told him. For now, we need to start sweeping the areas we haven't looked at yet, and... My sentence was cut off by the sudden erupting sound of a dog's bark, but it was a bark that didn't sound very typical, not for any regular dog I knew anyway. This one was bassy and reverberated as if it possessed its own internal echo. That wasn't mentioning the slight distortion it had as well. The lights in the food court suddenly began to flicker, and we all snapped to attention, preparing to defend ourselves. "Ron, behind you," Terrence calls out, pointing his finger at whatever he was referring to. I turn around. Behind me was the hallway that converged on the food court and led into the large corridor where all the various shops and businesses resided. In the space that bordered both the food court and the corridor was a thick shadow, a shadow in the shape of a medium-sized dog, and just like with its human nocturnal counterparts. Its eyes glowed a bright red. They pierced through the on and off darkness as the lights continued to flicker. Not even the four-legged ones are safe from assimilation, huh? I announce uneventfully, unable to find words to accurately describe the bizarre nature of the encounter. Guess not, poor pup, Melody adds. The nocturnal canine then begins to slowly levitate in our direction, barking deep as the flickering of the lights intensifies. I raise my light weapon, pointing it at the creature as he approaches closer with every passing second. He ain't a pup anymore, Carter adds, eagerly lifting his light weapon in the air just as Alex had backed out of the path of his beam. "Put it down, I've got it," I tell him, reaching over to switch on my light. But instead of obeying, he recoils, looking at me as if I had just challenged his intelligence. "What, you don't think I can handle one little ghost dog?" He grills, prompting me to lower my brows at him in frustration. "I'm not an idiot, you know." "Shut it," I snarl in return. The dog was now less than a dozen feet away, and I had to act. I put my finger on the light weapon slider and pushed it to the low setting, instantly bathing the canine in an ocean of light. Its loud, echoey bark converts to a shallow and reverberated whimper, signifying its wave of agony before annihilation. You all start heading down. I'm going to stay back and finish sweeping the court with Carter. I posizie, causing Carter to shoot me a worried look. We'll be on comms and let you know if we run into anything. Melody nods. Perfect. We'll catch up in a couple of minutes. Garrett, Melody, Terrence, and Alex all turn and head down the main aisle. I watch them cautiously turn the corner, and remind them once more to watch each other's backs and to contact me if they get into trouble. And speaking of, I turned my attention over to Carter, who stood just a few feet to my right. Judging by the expression that crept up on his face, he knew what he was in for. It wasn't fear per se, but he looked guilty. "I'm sorry," he said calmly, prompting me to put a hand up. "You know, I could sit here and chew you out, yell at you, even used to do a few slaps across the mouth back when I first started. Anyway, just want to let you know that when I say something, I need it done in that way, at that time. And as you can see, the stuff we do isn't a 9 to 5 in an air-conditioned office. If you screw up here, it ain't gonna result in paperwork getting shoved in the wrong filing cabinet. People die on this job. Many have, and many will continue. We don't have room for questioning your superiors, not on the field at least. Because hesitation means death when you do what we do," I said before pausing, as Carter had looked desperate to interject a thought of his own after I spoke my last sentence. "It's not like I chose to be here, a lot of us didn't. Sir," he punctuates last second, "don't tell Garrett I said that." And despite the mood I had been in for the past 20 minutes, I smiled, finding his slight awkwardness charming in a strange way, but realized I still needed to address the issue at hand. "You were a forced recruit?" "They told me they stopped doing that a long time ago," I informed him, my face contorting into a frustrated expression. "Yeah, I saw some stuff that I wasn't supposed to see. They told me they couldn't let me go back out into the public with the things I witnessed. Garrett and I were with each other when it happened. We were kids," he says somberly. I couldn't help but sympathize. Perhaps I was just going soft. "I'm sorry, man, but as long as you throw my respect my way, I'll throw it back. Just next time make sure to trust my leadership in public and ask me questions in private. All right?" Carter only responds with a slow nod. And just as I was about to tell him we needed to go catch up with the others, both of our radios suddenly crackle to life, the distorted and frantic voice of Melody coming through them. I snap to attention, going silent in order to listen with Carter. "Ron, we need you. They're moving in on us," she cries, the tone of urgency ever so present. "Let's go now," I bark, beginning to turn and break into a run, or rather something resembling one, as I still had to carry my light weapon. Carter takes up the rear, following close behind me as we dart forward. It was only a matter of seconds before we passed the area where the food court and shopping hall initially converged, and then made a hard left, all the ceiling lights flickering down the entire length of the corridor, towards the middle section of which I spotted Terrence, Garrett, Alex, and Melody, all standing in a circular formation with their light weapons aimed and ready at the dozens of nocturnals that surrounded them. Fear and stress obvious in all their expressions. "Hang on," I called out, waving Carter over to keep pace with me as we started to head in their direction. But our attempt to intervene would be halted before we could even get 5 steps in their direction. The flickering of the lights greatly intensifies in a matter of seconds, all the way up to the point where they completely went out, drenching the corridor in a more potent darkness. I told Carter to get next to me and prepare for a fight, and it would be coming soon enough. I looked around, spotting several pairs of the nocturnals' eyes surrounding the both of us, but they didn't move. Not yet anyway, they just surrounded us, as if to make sure there were no gaps for us to escape their clutches. "Is everything okay over there? What's going on?" Jennifer radios in, but I was in no position to make a reply. "This is not your hour, Ron," boomed the voices of the nocturnals, all synchronizing as they said it. I could hear a mix of both men, women, and even what sounded like a young child, that last part being further confirmed by a pair of red eyes that sat far below the rest, indicating a significant difference in height, a nocturnal that had an outline resembling a young girl. I go to quickly switch my weapon on, reaching for the slider just as Carter releases a blood-curdling shriek. I turn around, watching as one of the nocturnals yanked him further back into the darkness, causing him to drop his weapon and scream for his life as he vanished from my sight. "No!" I hollered desperately, frantic in my maneuvers to fight back. "Ron!" R. Carter cried out. I brought my weapon up and aimed it in the general direction he had been grabbed, this time wasting not a single moment turning it on, and to the highest level I had used up to this point. I couldn't let him die. The light exploded out, creating a beam that was so powerful I had to turn away as I waved the weapon from side to side. The nocturnals in the most immediate path of the beam were all almost instantly evaporated, having no chance to retreat or counterattack. They themselves also let out horrific cries of pain as the light made contact with their phantom anatomy, but I didn't care for their pain. They were human once, people like you and me who lived full and complex lives, but not anymore. They were simply creatures bent on the extermination of anything that wasn't themselves. "Ah!" came another hellish scream from further down the corridor, but this one hadn't sounded like it was coming from the nocturnals. No. It sounded much more human, and the reality of it being one of us registered with me quickly. The ones who hadn't been directly in the path of the light weapons beam when I had turned it on began to move in on me, so I immediately threw myself forward and then did a 180, now shining the light at the nocturnals who were previously behind me. But this group was prepared. They all quickly dispersed, avoiding the direct path of the beam, all of them quickly levitating to either side of it just before I had finished turning around. But the brightness was far too powerful for that to completely shield them from its effects. The few nocturnals on each side all quickly dashed backward, screeching and crying out in agony as they attempted to retreat. But I backed up and kept the light pointed forward in front of me while turning my head to look for Carter. "Where'd you go? Carter, are you okay?" I shouted frantically, only to feel my stomach sink once I received no response from him. "Carter," I called out again. "Tell me you're all right. Hey, here." I heard him reply rather weakly from a distance, but my eyes were focused forward at the group of nocturnals all attempting to flank around and ambush me at the sides. Hearing Carter's voice brought me some relief, but not enough. I turned, swinging my arms left and right, letting the light blare on either side of me to keep them at bay. The ones at the very front of each group were quickly evaporated, while the ones further back merely screeched and levitated backward into the darkness, their eyes being the only remaining indicator of their presence. I turned only my head and spotted Carter laying on the floor just a few feet behind me. "Can you get up?" I asked. "Are you injured?" I don't know," he responds, his voice hoarse. I see him crawl forward and try to lift himself up in my peripheral vision. Carter groans as I work on dispatching the remaining nocturnals, first shining my light directly on the group to my right and evaporating them in the beam before I swing my body to terminate the ones on my left. They were already prepared, dispersing as far apart as they could before I was able to get the beam directly on them. I see a pair of eyes dart toward me, and before I could even react, my weapon was promptly yanked from my hands, getting thrown to the left and sliding along the floor in a harsh skid. The beam lightly flickers once it comes to a stop, seemingly from internal damage as a result of the manhandling. The nocturnal responsible was now right in front of me. I could feel a cold, ice-like and tight grip on my shoulder in the shape of a human hand. In a panic, I attempted to reach for my more traditional sidearm, but a second grip found its way around my arm. stopping it dead in its tracks. I looked up and to my left, unable to move, now seeing two pairs of those glowing eyes staring right into my soul, and I thought all my years of experience would prepare me for my own demise, but no. I knew what was in store for me, and it was a fate far worse than death. I didn't think it would be possible for me to feel terror like that anymore, but there I was, being proven horribly wrong. The nocturnals both continue their stare as I feel an icy chill run its way up my spine, and it wasn't metaphorical. I legitimately felt like I was going to freeze to death right then and there. It was a sensation cold that was unlike any other I had experienced up to that point. Assimilation. Both of their voices combined to say, echoing and reverberating right in my ears. And just as I thought it would be the end for me, that I was going to be transformed into a malicious, red-eyed shadow man, a sudden burst of light erupts from the left. I immediately close my eyes as I hear the two nocturnals let out their now recognizable shrieks and cries of pain before the grip on both my shoulder and arm suddenly loosens. I drop to my knees with my eyes still closed as I shiver and my teeth chatter. It felt like I had just stepped out into the middle of Antarctica while being nude. Once I felt the brightness fade and knew it was safe to open my eyes again. I did just that, looking to my left and seeing Carter standing there, panting heavily with his light weapon in hand. Are you okay? He inquires, not looking 100% himself either. I nod my head slowly to answer his question. He then walks over, reaching out his left hand and offering me to take it, which I do, thanking him for saving my life while my teeth still slightly chattered. Hello? Is everything okay? Why haven't I been getting comms? Jennifer radios in once more. Her tone was frantic. It was rare that she ever lost her cool, even in scenarios like this. I reached up and got on my comms, quickly getting a reply out to calm Jennifer's nerves. The current group has been terminated. Still have to do a head count, I say, trying to keep my tone calm despite what had just transpired. I look over to the rest of the group. They all came running over to Carter and I while we were both in the midst of regaining ourselves. But hey, at least we can both say we survived a nocturnal assimilation initiation. More than all these poor bastards could say. When the rest of the team made it over, I was hoping to hear things like, "Are you two okay? No one is hurt. We're fine." But no, nothing could ever be that simple, and my rare feeling of optimism was quickly shot down by what Melody was soon to inform me of. "We can't find Terrence. Alex says he saw him get grabbed by one of those things when we were surrounded and in the struggle." My jaw dropped as I heard it. It took a minute to register in my head. After everything that we had survived and endured together, he would be taken out like that. As much as the more logistical side of me knew he was probably beyond saving, I still held out hope. "Do you know if he was assimilated for sure?" I probed, desperate for the answer I wanted to hear. Alex stepped up, the expression on his face telling me he wasn't in any hurry to spill the beans. "No. They were just all around us in every direction. We almost got overwhelmed. All I know is I saw him get thrown back into the darkness by a few of those things. I was held up by the ones that were immediately on my ass, and I couldn't shine my light over in time to help him." He punctuates, looking at the floor while slowly shaking his head. "But if he's nowhere to be found, I think we were too late." "So you're saying you had a chance to help him but saved your own skin instead?" Carter grilled in a snarly tone. "Hey, I messed up all right. Get off my ass. If you both got grabbed by them and survived, I'm sure he could have too. Maybe we just need to look harder." Alex retorts. "Yeah, you say that, yet instead of doing that, you decided to come over here and waste all this time talking about it." "All right, shut it, both of you," I erupted. I think we gotta face the fact Terrence is gone. We have a mission to complete and we need to finish the rest of these things off. He was a smart man and a good agent. He knew the risks of this job, and we'll make sure to avenge him, but we can't stop now. My little pseudo-speech was met with mostly silence, with the exception of Melody, who seemed to be taking it harder than anyone else. Or maybe that was me, and I just had an easier time hiding it. After everything, why did he have to go down like that? She said softly, shaking her head left and right. We're all going to make sure it wasn't in vain, I said in the most reassuring tone I could muster. After we all took a moment to regain ourselves from the encounter, I radioed to Jennifer and let her know that Terrence had more than likely been assimilated. Her reaction was what I mostly expected, although I could sense a slight bit of grief in the tone of her reply. But I didn't push my luck by saying anything about it. You sure you just didn't take any hallucinogens? Melody cracked sarcastically, prompting a light-hearted chuckle from each team member. As we finished sharing our small bit of laughter, I spot the entrance of the sports con store. To the right of said entrance was a large, 12-foot display statue of Santa Claus. Its face was sculpted in a way that made it look a little uncanny, almost as if it was staring at us and following our every movement with its eyes. Yeah, I'm sure children will just be dying to run up to that thing, Melody blurts. You read my mind, I added. Only Satan would want to sit on that lap. As we neared the entrance, I radioed Jennifer, just to let her know that we had made it. When you complained earlier, I sent out a second recon chopper to scan the building and see if you missed any. According to the imaging scan data they sent back to the site, the remaining lot of them should be inside that store, so all you have to do is take them out and you'll be okay to head back to the transport truck. She informs me. I stop both myself and the team, relaying what Jennifer had just said, prompting them all to look relieved that it would all be over soon enough. What are you going to do without a light? Won't it be too dangerous? Asked Melody, genuine concern in her voice. I'm going to do what I failed to do earlier. Watch all of your backs and make sure no one gets caught off guard. You guys got this. I'll be fine. I nod, and as if on cue, the lights in the corridor begin to violently flicker once more, prompting all of us to get into a back-to-back stance, as we had done previously. But I wasn't as fearful this time around. I actually felt confident. I had a team, a smart, capable team, and despite what we had lost up to this point, we were gonna make sure it served a purpose. Let's show these things what we're made of, I snarled, trying to get Carter, Garrett, Alex, and Melody to share my current mindset. The flickering of the lights intensifies. I keep an eye on the entrance to the store as we all anticipate seeing the shadows, the red eyes, and hearing the distorted voices that were all too familiar. If I die, I just want to let you guys know that you're not the morons I thought you were, Carter announces. We're gonna make it, Alex growled in response, clearly not sharing Carter's doubts. If we all keep our heads on straight, we'll be okay, Melody adds. The flickering reaches a breaking point, and soon enough it felt like we were standing in the middle of a dance floor in some low-budget nightclub. The constant millisecond transitions between darkness and light became disorienting. We all verbally complained and cursed, waiting for the shadowy adversaries to show themselves. And we got what we wished for soon enough. Suddenly the flickering comes to a halt, and this particular corridor goes dark, the only sources of light being that from inside the stores on either side of where we stood. Looking back at the entrance to the SportsCon store, I saw the pairs of red eyes begin to appear. 2 at a time, they popped up within the pool of darkness right outside the door. I counted 40 pairs, all of them lined up with each other in a perfect single-file fashion, if you could call it that. They all focused on us, making not a single movement as we watched each other. Light is a plague, came the amalgamation of all sorts of their voices at once. the echoes of such carrying its way down the corridor. I ordered everyone to stand their ground, be alert, and prepare as we waited for them to initiate their attack, an attack that I was sure would leave us in great peril. This is the single biggest group we had faced inside the building yet, and we were down one light weapon. But the moments went by and they never moved forward. It left me wondering what they were planning and what strategy they had in mind to utilize against us. Perhaps they were even smarter than previously assumed. Just when I had thought it was going to turn into some long standoff, they were suddenly in motion once again. Not at us, though, no. They all darted toward the giant statue of Santa Claus outside the store entrance. "What the hell?" Melody questioned, flabbergasted in her tone, and judging by everyone's expressions, we all agreed with her. They all began to surround the statue, making a perfect circular formation around the structure. And after holding that position for only a few seconds, they levitated forward in a violently quick manner, all of their bodies visibly passing inside the statue itself. We all then slowly backed up at my command, and I watched with the rest of the team in a combination of horror and awe as this strange, mind-bending event took place right in front of us. Once all 30 of the nocturnals had gone inside, the statue's white marble exterior slowly began to shift color. The marble appears to maintain its hardness as it transformed into a pitch-black shade. Of course, like that of a shadow. Everything but the red hat, coat, and boots all turned black and took on the form of a shadow, and each of the statue's creepy eyes disappeared behind 2 separate walls of glowing rose-red circular blobs. I don't know how, or if they had been able to do things like this the whole time, but I wasn't going to get much time to ponder on it anyway. "Did they just—" Alex began. "Yeah, they just went full-on Power Rangers," Garrett said, finishing Alex's sentence. The nocturnal statue then slowly moves forward, its right foot inching forward and hitting the floor with a hard bang, prompting me to question if it was still truly solid despite the fact it had the form of nocturnal. Or at least, it did on the outside. "Lights on! Now, full power!" I shout, as the nocturnal Santa then turns his head, looking down at us with nothing but malice and spite. Melody, Garrett, Carter, and Alex all switched their light weapons on while also making sure they all stood shoulder to shoulder to avoid getting blinded. The 4 of them all coordinated, concentrating their beams directly on Nocturnal Santa. But this has very minimal effects, as I stood back and watched the statue turn its now shadowy head and raise an arm to block the light out. It seemed to be doing nothing more than simply irritating the newly formed creature. I immediately get myself on communications. As it was clear to me, we simply did not possess the proper firepower to take this thing on, and we would die trying if we continued. "Jennifer, I'm going to need some backup out here now," I desperately plead, avoiding an incoming piece of debris that had been torn up from one of the statue's footsteps. With its arms still covering its eyes, the creature takes a step forward and lunges downward, attempting to swat all of us away with its left arm. Luckily, this thing was slow enough for all of us to react in time and evade what would have been a fatal blow. "What's going on over there? Why do you need extra help?" Jennifer replied after my radio crackled to life. "Not really any time to explain. Please just get another team out here immediately." Nocturnal Santa charges forward at me, the ground below cracking and shaking as he, or it, moves at a much faster and far more terrifying pace than previously. The statue raises one of its shadow arms and makes a fist, preparing to slam it down and crush me as if I was nothing more than an insect. But I maneuver just in time, falling backward and somersaulting out of the spot of the impact. The marble floor is instantly smashed to pieces upon impact just mere feet in front of me, and with our light weapons being useless against this monstrosity, I knew that we weren't going to be able to fight this thing off. not without backup. So I told the team to do the only thing we really could do: run. "Let's go, drop the weapons. All of you," I shouted while still on my butt. But after quickly jumping back up to my feet, I waved them over to join me in what would end up being one of the most intense cardio exercises of our lives. And I didn't have to tell them twice. They all immediately dropped their light weapons and darted over to me. Alex led the pack, Melody wasn't far behind, and Garrett and Carter took up the rear. As they all caught up with me and put distance between themselves and their weapons, the statue raised a foot high, held it for a second, and brought it down with devastating force, smashing all 4 of the lights as if they were made of nothing more than cheap cardboard. The lights in the mall began to flicker more severely than ever as we ran down the corridor in a full sprint, with the statue not all that far behind us. I held out hope we would survive. As I stated earlier, Site 12 wasn't very far away from the mall, and if we booked it, by the time the second team had finished gearing up and heading over in a helicopter, we'd be able to meet them at the front of the mall, but only if we didn't stop. "Back to the entrance, go!" I exclaim like a drill sergeant. The lights continue flickering as I hear the thunderous footsteps of the statue behind us, the floor being cracked and smashed with every stride that thing took. "You cannot stop the darkness." Its voice boomed, and it sounded nothing like Santa, but just another group of nocturnals all collaborating on their vocals. We all began panting as we kept pumping our legs. I could feel the strain with every step, but I knew what stopping meant, for me and the rest of the team. Midway through the death-defying run, I thought of any possible way to slow this thing down, panicking as I failed to come up with anything that wouldn't get me or one of them killed. And it appeared Garrett had the same idea. He turned around and quickly pulled his sidearm from his belt, aiming it right at the statue as he prepared to take a shot. That is, until I dashed over and grabbed the pistol out of his hands before slapping his arm down. "I can buy us time," he blurted. "No, you're not playing hero. Let's go," I demanded with the fury of an angry father. Garrett, however, was quick to obey once he and I were nearly crushed by the slamming of the statue's fist just before we took off running again. Both of us hollering as we jumped back just in the nick of time. We round the corner and finished making our way through the main shop corridor, now merging into the food court area, with the entrance in our line of sight. We dash into the food court, running right down the middle and evading the tables, chairs, and support beams, while the statue just simply smashed and ran right through them. They did very little in the way of slowing this thing down. "The second team's chopper should be arriving any second. Just hang on," came Jennifer once more through the radio. But it brought me no relief, not with how much adrenaline was pumping through my veins at the time. And she was right. On the other side of the large pane glass window just above the mall entrance doors, I spotted the chopper hovering around 30 feet off the ground, waiting for us to make it outside. I kept going, keeping pace with Melody, Carter, and Alex as I caught up with them. But Garrett had lagged significantly behind when I turned my head to look back, and the statue had its eyes on him. All of us practically threw ourselves outside of the entrance. All of us except Garrett, who was still a couple dozen feet inside the mall, the look of horror on his face being contagious as we watched a piece of debris the statue had kicked forward hit him in the back and sent him face first right onto the floor. "No!" Carter screamed, but his voice was drowned out by the sound of the whipping of the helicopter's blades as it lowered itself to be more level with the entrance door, and by extension, the statue. The statue stops for just a matter of moments and lifts its leg up and preparing to smush Garrett and turn him into a pile of human mush. Carter then suddenly lunges forward, attempting to run back for his friend. And despite all the running he had just done, it was clear he still had plenty of adrenaline left in him to try and save Garrett. "Carter, no!" I exclaim, trying and failing to chase after him. He left me in the dust as I tried to stop him before he made it back to the entrance. I didn't want to sit there and watch Garrett meet his demise either, but I couldn't risk Carter potentially suffering the same fate. But it didn't matter, because as we neared the entrance, the chopper fired an explosive rocket into the building. I could barely even comprehend the trail of smoke and the rippling sound of the rocket as it propelled past us. But once the rocket hit its target, that being the statue, the resulting explosion sent both me and Carter flying back several feet. I groaned and howled as I rolled across the ground before coming to a stop after a few seconds. Blood made its way down my forehead, and I could feel that my gear had suddenly felt much warmer around me due to the heat of the explosion. That wasn't even mentioning the ringing in my ears. Carter had gone unconscious, but according to Melody, he was still breathing. Alex had darted over to me as I looked back at the now desecrated entryway in a speechless expression, waiting for all the nocturnals that were previously inside the now destroyed statue to emerge and commence an attack in their separate forms. But they never came, which puzzled me, considering how I had seen them function up to this point. "You all right, boss?" he asked, but I only knew because I read his lips. I didn't verbally respond. I simply kept staring forward, knowing that the threat had been eliminated. But we still lost another team member. There was not a chance in hell Garrett had survived the blast, and the last thing I wanted to see was the various pieces of him that had probably been flung every which way. It wasn't long after that when the second team came down and assessed what had happened before taking us back to Site 12, and as it turns out, I suffered a fracture in my arm. Wasn't fun at all when the pain set in after the adrenaline wore off. The medical division did their thing, and I was going to be in a cast for an uncertain period. But hey, at least that meant a break from field work for a bit. Alex ended up going back to his site until he was supposed to permanently transfer over here, and I had honestly looked forward to potentially working with him in the future. Jennifer ended up allowing me a couple days of rest before we had a post-mission conference between the two of us, and I was ready to get chewed out, or worse. I took that time to do some very limited training with Melody as we talked about all the insane experiences we had with Terrence over the years. It wasn't gonna ever be the same without him. Carter was more than broken up by what had happened to Garrett, and I couldn't blame him. That was a childhood friend of his after all, and after everything they had went through, he had been snuffed out. Just like that. Sometimes I wish a bit more mercy existed in the world. I went out of my way to invite him to sit in on a few leadership meetings, of course, making sure that I had been authorized to do so first. But soon enough, the final day came for me to give Jennifer my answer about the offer for Assistant Director of Operations, and just like that, I found myself inside her office once again. Is there a reason the missile was able to kill all the ones inside the statue without any light-based weapons being needed? Would have been nice to know if it was that simple the whole time, I asked, doing my best to bite my tongue as I said it. I actually asked Dr. Garth and his team the same thing, as we had no records or documents of the Nocturnals ever doing something like that before. Garth said it's most likely due to the fact that the Nocturnals can only fully assimilate a living, breathing creature made up of organic matter, and that because they attempted to assimilate an object, especially one that large, it didn't turn out the same. They seemed to end up trapping themselves inside the statue, and when it was destroyed, they were as well, due to some of its more solid properties transferring into theirs. I wasn't even quite sure how that made any sense, but it's like I always say, nothing makes sense in this job. I didn't have anything to say in response to her explanation, so she of course moved on, not wanting to waste any time. So I know you're aware of what I need from you today. I'm sure you've had plenty of time to think it over. I need to know, Ron. Do you want this promotion? Jennifer sighs, cupping her hands together on top of her desk, I looked at my cast, and then at the floor. The room went so quiet that all you could hear was the blowing of the air conditioning. I had made my mind up about this matter as soon as the mission ended. I was just circulating through all the different ways to tell Jennifer in my head. But soon enough, it came to me, and it was the answer I should have given all along. No. Hell's Civil War, the Iron Tower. It took a while for the circumstances of my death to come back to me. The memory was thrust back into my conscious mind during our descent into a swirling vortex at the base of the Iron Tower, as my companions and I escaped from one hellscape, only to be plunged into another. The end of my mortal life came during one wet and miserable afternoon on a war-torn battlefield in Eastern Europe. At the time, my platoon was deployed along a supposedly quiet section of the front, and I guess I got complacent. I recall being soaked to the skin as I trudged through the mud and scanned the gray horizon. I took a step and heard a sudden ominous click underneath my boot. A cold terror ran through my veins as my brain just had enough time to process what had occurred. A second later, the landmine I'd unwittingly stepped upon detonated. My last conscious feeling was one of intense heat, and then I was blown to kingdom come. And the next thing I remembered was waking up in hell, thrust into yet another bloody war. Although in this realm the battles are fought between demons and damned souls, rather than human soldiers and their high-tech weapons. What can I say about Dis, the ugly and worn-torn city where they sent me? The fifth circle is violence, and Dis is its capital. This is where most dead soldiers and generals end up. That's not to say there aren't honorable soldiers who fight for righteous causes. But the old saying is true: war is hell. The bloodshed and violence changes a man. It corrupts his soul and forces the mark of Cain upon him. And in the end, few, if any, escape unscathed. You can't die in hell, but you can suffer. They can blow your body apart, chop your head off your shoulders. But the suffering never ends. When I awoke in the afterlife, I was instantly confronted with the true horrors of Dis, experiencing the foul stench of death, seeing the medieval city burn under the flames of 1,000 fires, and witnessing towering demons and bloodthirsty harpies tearing lost souls to shreds. I suppose I should count myself lucky that I met 2 Dis veterans who took me under their wing. I knew little about Sebastian and Isabel, 2 damned souls who'd died in past wars before being dropped into the terror-filled streets of Dis. It was Isabel, the mysterious Amazon-like warrior, who'd explained the origins of the conflict. Minos was the gatekeeper of hell and former recruiter of Satan's army. But the serpent-like demon had revolted against Lucifer in an attempt to take control of the underworld and 9 circles. We were conscripts in Minos's ramshackle army, essentially serving as cannon fodder in the vicious battle for control of Dis. The press-ganged souls we served alongside had little loyalty to Minos or his cause. They fought for one reason only: the chance of freedom. Our demonic overlord had made a promise to his soldiers. More than anything, Minos wanted control over the Iron Tower, the tall and dominating monolith which was key to the entire fifth circle. If we could capture the tower and reach its summit, our master would give us a second chance at life and facilitate our return to the mortal plane. As far as we were concerned, this was a prize worth fighting for, but of course there was a price to pay, and it was a heavy one. The 3 of us literally leapt into the vortex which marked the entrance to the Iron Tower, as our former comrades burnt in an unholy fire behind us. I must have lost consciousness during the chaotic transition, because I awoke on a cold floor within a dark, windowless chamber, dimly lit by torches burning on the black and featureless walls. My companions were standing above me, Sebastian with his huge bulking frame blocking out the dim light, remaining silent as always as he looked down upon me with piercing eyes. To his right was Isabel, a thin smile on her dry lips, as she no doubt planned to say something clever or sarcastic. The woman exerted confidence, on the surface at least, but in reality, I could see fear behind her wide eyes. Sebastian offered me a hand and helped me to my feet while Isabel whispered in my ear, "Welcome to the Iron Tower, Jacob. Now the real fun begins." I ignored her attempt at humor as I surveyed our grim surroundings. The darkened chamber was small and tight, appearing to be an entryway to whatever lay inside the twisted tower. I noted the steel doors ahead of us, marked by strange and disturbing symbols. From the other side of the door, we could hear the muffled sounds of a deep voice, which seemed to be leading some kind of prayer. The heavy door was shut, and I didn't want to imagine what was occurring in the next room. But the door was the only way out of the chamber we currently occupied, and we had to move forward. And suddenly the fireball soared through the air and hit the helpless victim, engulfing his broken body in an unholy fire. The man screamed one last time before his body was burnt away, dissolving into ashes in front of our eyes. With the sacrifice made, the pentagram was consumed by a circle of white flames, which burnt fiercely, as Lucifer apparently absorbed the victim's soul. And even though his physical body was reduced to cinders, we could still hear the victim's disembodied screams echoing throughout the chamber, as his eternal suffering had surely reached a whole new level of savage horror. I shuddered over what I'd just witnessed. That's not to say I wasn't familiar with acts of violence. I'd seen and participated in many such acts during my military career. But the normalization of the cruelty and savagery in hell was beyond anything I'd previously been subjected to. I continued to stare in mesmerized horror at the burning pentagram until I was shaken back to reality by Isabel. "We need to keep moving," she whispered. "We can't stay here." I nodded my head in agreement, as did Sebastian. The three of us moved forward cautiously, keeping our bladed weapons to hand in case we needed to fight our way through. But we were seriously outnumbered. I counted a dozen red-robed cultists in total, 13 if you counted their leader. I didn't fancy our chances if it came to a stand-up fight, and so we planned to sneak past the cultists in the slim hope that they wouldn't notice our presence. But of course, we weren't so lucky. In an instant, the dozen cult members turned their backs on the fire as they all faced in our direction. I still couldn't see their faces, which remained hidden under their hoods, but we could see their hideous eyes, burning red with a fiery intensity. Whatever these things were, they definitely weren't human. The daggers emerged next as all 12 cultists withdrew their still blood-soaked daggers and pointed them menacingly in our direction. The three of us formed a defensive line and prepared to fight as the armed cultists slowly advanced upon us. But to our immense surprise, their leader intervened as he called out to his bloodthirsty followers. "Do not attack," he ordered. "Let them pass. Their souls belong to the Dark Lord, and only he can decide their fate." His words chilled me to my bones even after the cultists wordlessly obeyed their leader's orders, withdrawing their daggers and standing aside to let him pass. We moved forward cautiously, keeping our weapons handy as we prepared for the possibility of a double cross. There was a second door on the far side of the chamber, which appeared to be the only way out of the room. None of the cultists attempted to stop our progress as we made our way past the scene of the brutal sacrifice. But to get to the door, we needed to pass the altar where the pale-faced warlock stood. His cold eyes followed us closely as we walked. I thought he'd keep his promise and let us go, but suddenly the warlock shot forward at incredible speed, heading straight for me and grabbing hold of my body before I had a chance to resist. He knocked the blade out of my hand with ease before taking a firm hold, pulling me so close as I was forced to look into his cold eyes and felt his icy breath against my skin. "Let him go," Isabel screamed, as she held her knife up to his throat. But the warlock didn't even seem to notice as he continued to stare right into my eyes. I shook uncontrollably in his tight grasp, as he spoke his chilling words into my ear. But, to my surprise, he delivered what sounded more like a warning than a threat. "You are entering a hell beyond your worst nightmares and will be forced to face the darkest corners of your own psyche," he whispered. "You cannot trust anyone or anything. And remember one thing, Jacob. Evil begins in the heart, as impure blood is pumped through the arteries and corrupts the body. To defeat evil, you must eliminate the source." I didn't understand what the warlock meant, but was relieved when he released me from his icy grip. "Go now," he said, as I returned to my comrades. "Proceed to the next level." I led the way, still shaken by the encounter with the ghoulish entity. I placed my hand on the ivory handle and experienced a chilling foreboding as I opened the heavy door which allowed us to proceed to the next area. What we found behind the next doorway was a narrow spiral staircase leading upwards. It was similar to what one would find inside a medieval castle, except that the steps were forged from iron rather than carved from stone. None of us liked it. The stairs were so narrow that we could only proceed one at a time, and we couldn't see around corners, which meant we could be ambushed at any point. The staircase seemed like a death trap, but what choice did we have? None of us wished to return to the previous chamber to face those bloodthirsty cultists and their demonic leader. So, after a short discussion, we decided to ascend. Sebastian led the way up the spiral stairs. He was the strongest and so best placed to defend our small party from a sudden attack. Meanwhile, Isabel walked in the middle while I took up the rear. I don't know how many steps we climbed in our ascent. I lost count. All I know is that I was soon exhausted and disorientated. I think my companions were also tired and frustrated, and we weren't fully alert when the attack finally came. Sebastian let out a sharp cry, raising his machete to counter the swing of his enemy's blade. I heard the distinctive sound of steel striking steel, and saw what looked like a medieval knight on the staircase attacking Sebastian with a short sword. The attacker wore a full suit of black armor with an inverted cross emblazoned on his chest plate. He wore a helmet which covered his face, but I could see his eyes through the visor, eyes which burnt a demonic red. He screeched like a banshee as he swung his sword, and Sebastian struggled to defend himself as he desperately parried the attacks. Unfortunately, both Isabel and I were unable to help our comrade because the staircase was too narrow, but I would have problems of my own before too long. I heard the heavy stomping of footsteps behind me, turning just in time to confront a second attacker. Yet another dark knight charged up the stairs towards me. He was clad in the same black armor and seemed identical to the first attacker. His red eyes burned with a fiery intensity, and he let out a hellish wail before thrashing out with his sword. I reacted on instinct, using my own blade to block the attacker's sword. But the sheer force of the attack knocked me off my feet as I tripped on the steps. The fiendish knight continued his assault, attacking with his blade as I struggled to parry the hard blows. I don't think I would have lasted much longer, but thankfully Isabel came to my rescue. I remained on the ground as she thrust out with her knife, stabbing the knight in his throat, after expertly finding the gap between his body armor and helmet. A moment later, Isabel kicked out and sent the knight tumbling down the metal staircase. While this was happening, Sebastian gained the upper hand over the first knight, using his machete to saw through the enemy's neck. Our comrade made good use of his brute strength to cut through flesh and bone until he severed the knight's head completely. Next, Sebastian calmly lifted the severed head and held it aloft. To my horror, I noticed how the knight's red eyes were still burning as they looked down upon us. But Sebastian wasted no time before he tossed the head down the stairs, and it bounced off the iron steps before disappearing from sight. Jesus Christ! I swore in shock after the savage assault. Jesus didn't save your ass, I did, was Isabel's cynical reply. Now, get back on your feet, soldier. We're not going to carry you through this. I nodded my head as I got back up on my feet and lifted my blade. Isabel's warning was clear to me. I knew both she and Sebastian were determined to reach the tower's summit, and they wouldn't hesitate to leave me behind if I slowed them down. The last thing I wanted was to be left alone in this hellscape, to face the horrors which inhabited it. We proceeded up the staircase, stepping over the knight's beheaded body, whilst Isabel took this sword. We didn't know where the steps would end, and expected a further ambush at any moment. But miraculously, we soon reached the top of the staircase and were confronted by yet another steel door, with an ivory handle. Both Isabel and I held back, staring at each other as if we shared a mutual feeling of dread at whatever lay on the far side. But it was Sebastian who stepped forward, placing his huge but now shaking hand upon the ivory before he slowly pushed the door open. We entered yet another dark chamber, dimly lit by torches and seemingly empty at first glance, although I noticed the foul stench emanating from inside. The chamber stank of rotting flesh and something even fouler, which certainly didn't bode well. Sebastian walked out first, and it quickly became apparent that something wasn't right. His heavy boots didn't march upon solid iron as we would have expected. Instead, his feet sank into wet mud, which apparently covered the entire floor within this latest hellish chamber. Sebastian looked back at us with anxious concern in his dark eyes. He'd sunk a few inches into the mud, and it was clear that our progress through this level would be slow and difficult. Nevertheless, we had to keep moving forward, no matter how tough our journey became. Isabel and I soon followed in Sebastian's footsteps and stepped into the inexplicable field of mud. We slugged through, struggling with each step as the mud hampered our progress. I could see the next doorway at the far end of the chamber, but this was a large room and it would surely take us a long time to make it across. Still, trekking through mud wasn't the worst horror I could imagine. But of course, the hellish chamber had yet another nasty surprise in store for us. I think I was the first to see it. A figure or creature emerging from the mud in front of us, digging its way to the surface and slowly crawling towards us. I shouted out a warning and pointed in that direction. But soon, more creatures emerged from underneath the muddy surface, all heading towards us. It was only when the creatures got close that I realized these entities were people, or at least they'd once been. Mud covered their faces and bodies, but I could just about make out their tattered uniforms underneath the grime and dirt. Their eyes were filled with madness and hunger, and their bodies were broken almost beyond recognition. Most were missing at least one leg, and none were able to stand upon the muddy ground. But they used whatever limbs they had left to crawl and push themselves forward. I counted at least 24, with more coming up to the surface with every passing moment. "Shit," Isabel swore. "We've got to move." Sebastian was the furthest forward of our trio, and so led the fight back. He tried to wade his way past the now moaning lost souls, but they grabbed and clawed at his legs and attempted to drag him down. Our comrade reacted with predictable violence, crushing skulls underfoot and slicing off their limbs and heads with his machete. It wasn't long before the ravenous souls reached me and Isabel, and we were forced to join the fight. The first living corpse attempted to bite my ankle before I brought my blade down, burying it in his skull. From that point onwards, I acted like a berserker, thrashing out and slaying zombie after zombie as I slowly fought my way forward towards the door and only exit. All three of us were fighting like hell, but we were seriously outnumbered. I glanced to my left and saw Isabel was in trouble, as 6 zombies had surrounded her. She cried out as the creatures clawed at her legs and started to pull her down into the mud. I moved towards her, wailing like a maniac as I started hacking and kicking. Before long, I'd slayed all the attackers, cutting their rotting bodies into pieces. I helped Isabel back onto her feet, and she shot me a smile whilst mouthing, "Thank you." I felt satisfied because I'd returned the favor and proved my worth, but we were still in significant danger. We continued the slow and desperate fight, trudging through mud whilst hacking our attackers up with our blades. The battle was tough and exhausting, but the three of us so nearly made it. Isabel and I managed to fight our way to the next door, but Sebastian lagged behind. I hadn't noticed during the violent chaos, but he seemed to be the main target of the legless zombies, as if they had a personal vendetta against him. We saw him about 10 yards behind us, desperately fighting against a host of the undead. They groaned and snarled in hungry anticipation, whilst grasping their victim's legs and biting into his flesh. Sebastian roared in fury and fought back with all his might, but there were too many for him. I wanted to run back and go to the aid of my stricken comrade, but Isabel stopped me, placing a firm hand on my shoulder and saying, "It's too late, Jacob." And sadly, she was right. Soon Sebastian's strength faltered, and the scrum of mud-caked bodies pulled him downwards. Our comrade dropped his machete and stopped fighting. It seemed he'd now accepted his fate. Sebastian looked towards us in the last moment, his eyes emotionless and his mouth firmly shut. I wanted to say something comforting to him but couldn't find the words. And a moment later, our comrade was pulled under the surface, his head disappearing into the mud as the old soldier faced an uncertain but surely horrific fate. I stood watching the now empty field of mud for a long moment before Isabel once again touched my shoulder. I turned to face my female companion and saw nothing but a steely determination in her eyes as she said, "We need to keep going. We've sacrificed too much to give up now." I nodded my head in silent agreement before placing my hand on the ivory handle and pushing the door open. Isabel and I both cried out in despair when we cast our eyes upon yet another spiral staircase leading upwards. I began to lose hope at this point, fearing that there was no escape from the dreaded Iron Tower, only suffering and torture throughout our endless ascent. Sebastian was gone now. We didn't speak his name or even verbally acknowledge his demise. I realized our ill-fated companion wasn't at peace. Instead, he'd surely been dragged to a deeper and darker circle of hell, where he'd be subjected to even worse torment. This would surely be our fate too, if or when we fell. I felt like dropping to my knees and screaming in despair, but I couldn't show such weakness in front of Isabel. After a short pause, we proceeded up the staircase. Isabel led the way while I followed. It seemed to make little difference, however, because an attack could come from ahead or behind. We proceeded slowly and with extreme caution, expecting to be assaulted by demonic knights at any moment. But when the attack eventually came, it was in a most unexpected form. I suddenly heard a low hissing from behind, turning to see a red serpent slithering up the stairs towards me. The snake was almost 2 feet in length, its reptilian eyes staring straight at me with a predatory zeal, as it continued to hiss aggressively and showed its sharp fangs. I shouted out a warning to Isabel before thrashing out with my blade and cutting the serpent in two. My victory was short-lived, however, as a moment later, I was assaulted by a host of multicolored snakes, which slithered over each other and up the staircase. The foul hissing was now near deafening, and I saw venom dripping from their fangs as their yellow eyes focused upon me. Isabel could not help, because the staircase was too narrow for 2 people to fight side by side, and so I had to defend myself. Desperately lashing out with my blade in a righteous fury, I culled snake after snake in the frenzied battle, and soon the steps were covered in their blood and guts, as the severed snake bodies continued to squirm and slither in a macabre display. I thought I had the vermin beaten, but one plucky serpent managed to get through my defenses and launch a vicious attack before I could react. The creature plunged its fangs deep into my flesh, causing me to scream in agony as I thrashed out to chop the snake in half. Next, I fell down on the steps as I grabbed hold of the serpent's head and tore it from my flesh, prompting another spike of pain. Fearfully, I looked down at the ghastly bite wound in my leg and soon felt nauseous. I swore I could feel the serpent's poison coursing through my veins, slowly corrupting every part of my body and inducing a horrific pain within me. I screamed again as my brain struggled to process the agony, and for a moment I thought I'd black out. But in an instant, Isabel was by my side, shaking me vigorously before slapping me hard across the face. "Damn it, Jacob," she exclaimed after the slap. "The venom can't kill you. You know this. It's going to hurt like hell, but you can't lose consciousness. Believe me, you don't want to give up now. You'll regret it for all eternity." I listened to her advice, somehow managing to stay conscious and get up on my shaking feet. My bad leg was going numb, and so Isabel had to support me as we struggled up the remaining steps before reaching the next door of cold steel. The chamber we entered was unremarkable at first glance. It was dimly lit and typically austere and featureless, but at least my nostrils weren't assaulted by a foul stench. And when we walked on the ground, it was solid. I was still in great pain, however, and so not fully aware of my surroundings or the potential threats within. Stumbling forward, I failed to notice Isabel's sudden change in demeanor as she no longer retained her tough and confident persona, and instead took on an uncharacteristic vulnerability. She let go of me and slowly walked towards the center of the dark chamber. I wondered what was drawing her until suddenly an inexplicable vision materialized in front of me. I thought I was hallucinating at first, but clearly Isabel saw it too, as she slowly proceeded towards the scene. What we saw was a representation of a child's bedroom, complete with a bed, cuddly toys, and cheap plywood furniture. The room looked entirely out of place in this hellish chamber, as did the young girl who sat upon the bed, humming to herself as she combed her doll's hair. The kid could only have been 8 or 9, her dark hair hanging long, and her hazel eyes shining with a childish innocence. The girl looked familiar to me, but I couldn't quite place her. She was obviously entirely oblivious to our presence, like we were outsiders secretly observing her private world. I felt very uncomfortable and unsettled, but noticed how my companion had become emotional, with tears openly rolling down her rosy cheeks as she watched the scene intently. Then all of a sudden, the bedroom door was violently kicked open, and a thuggish figure burst inside. The man looked huge compared to the little girl, his muscles bulging and face burning a bright red. I saw the thug clenching his fists as he screamed at the girl with a frightening fury. "God damn it, Belle. Didn't I tell you not to leave your bike in the driveway?" The girl was clearly terrified as she jumped off the bed and cowered in the corner whilst whimpering. "I'm sorry, Daddy." But his anger didn't diminish as he charged forward and grabbed her. "I'm so sick of this shit," he roared, before striking his daughter hard around the head. She cried out in pain, but this didn't stop the animal from hitting her again. Finally, the abusive father ended his sickening assault, leaving his innocent daughter bleeding on her bedroom floor as he stormed out of the room and slammed the door shut behind him. The scene of child abuse was sickening and disturbing, even compared to the horrors I'd already witnessed. Nevertheless, I didn't understand why the tower was showing this to us. But I soon got my answer. The girl continued to cry whilst rolled up in a ball on the floor. But suddenly a new voice could be heard, a disembodied, unnaturally deep, and decidedly inhuman voice, which chilled my very soul. "It's not going to stop, you know," he said. "Not unless we stop him." To my surprise, the girl responded as if she recognized the invisible entity speaking to her through the walls. "I told you to leave me alone. I don't want you here," she sobbed. "No more games, Belle." The voice replied sternly, "You know what must be done." "He's my daddy," she cried emotionally. "He'll keep hurting you." The voice added, Only I can stop him. I am your last friend, Belle, the only one who can protect you. And I will save you, my child, if you only ask. I'll keep you safe forever, and all I ask in return is your love and loyalty." Those last words chilled me, and it seemed like an eternity passed before the girl finally answered, whispering her one-word answer just loud enough to be heard. "Okay." With that, the image of the child's bedroom disappeared into thin air, and we were alone once more. I looked to Isabel as she glared back at me, her reddening eyes now focused like those of a deadly predator. And suddenly it all came together inside of my confused brain. Isabel was Belle, and we'd just witnessed a memory from her violent past. She'd made a deal with something evil to escape from her abusive father. But now there was a price to be paid. The temperature in the chamber suddenly dropped to freezing, and Isabel's hard stare cut through me as she spoke slowly and carefully in a cold tone. "So, now you know," she began. My jaw dropped as I struggled to find the words to reply. "What did you do, Isabel?" I asked fearfully. I noticed how her hand was poised on the grip of her sword as she explained. "The Dark Lord saved me from that abusive asshole. He gave me my life back, and I've served him ever since. They used to call me the Angel of Death. Did you know that? I was a sniper, the best in the business. How many souls did I send down to my master? Honestly, I stopped counting after I reached double figures. Send them all to hell, that was my motto. I served Lucifer well in the mortal realm, right up until the day they dropped a 1,000-pound bomb on my head." I shook my head, hardly believing what I was hearing. "I don't understand." I blurted out, "You fought for Minos, not for Lucifer. You recruited me into the rebel army." She smiled cruelly before replying, "I was never loyal to Minos. The Dark Lord sent me to infiltrate his forces and act as a spy within the traitor's army. I've performed this task to the best of my abilities, but what I really excel at is sending fresh souls to the 9th circle." She paused momentarily before delivering the killer line. "That's where you come in, Jacob." I noticed how she started walking slowly towards me, with her blade drawn. Sensing the threat, I started to back off whilst reaching for my own weapon. "Why?" I asked in confusion. "Why me?" She shrugged her shoulders whilst continuing her menacing approach. "Don't ask me. I'm just following orders. Lucifer wants you, Jacob. I guess he sees potential in you. But take my advice. Don't resist. This will all go a lot easier if you just let it happen." She smiled thinly, her eyes gradually changing color to blood red as she raised her sword to attack. But my heart was filled with defiance. Isabel had betrayed me, but I had no intention of going down without a fight. Nor would I ever willingly serve the devil. I was still suffering from the snake's venom and so in a weakened state, but nevertheless, a surge of adrenaline pumped through my corrupted veins as I launched a preemptive strike, thrashing out with my blade in an attempt to slice Isabel in two. She parried my blow, but this didn't deter me. Using my last reserves of strength, I struck again, this time slicing Isabel deep across her chest. But to my horror, she hardly seemed to notice the wound. Instead, my opponent merely laughed sadistically, her red eyes burning bright as she launched a retaliatory attack, deftly and precisely using her sword to test my defenses. I managed to block her first few attacks, but then she went low and cut my thigh. I screamed in pain and stumbled backwards. Isabel laughed again as she went in for the kill. I was weak and in a lot of pain, and I realized I wouldn't last for much longer. But strangely, at this moment, the cryptic advice of the warlock came back to me. Trust no one. Corruption comes from the heart. Destroy the source. Isabel clearly no longer considered me a threat as she raised her sword and prepared to cut my head off. I knew I had only one chance, and so took a deep breath and made my move, thrusting my blade deep into Isabel's exposed chest. By luck or skill, I struck the right spot, the force of my thrust penetrating her rib cage and plunging straight into her heart. Isabel didn't seem to acknowledge the injury at first as she looked down at her wound in confusion. But suddenly she cried out blue murder, the red in her eyes fading as her body literally fell apart and dissolved into ashes in front of my very eyes. I stood in shock for a moment, hardly able to believe what I'd just witnessed. I reckoned Isabel was now with her master, in whatever hellscape he called home. The devil would surely punish my former companion for her failure to capture my soul. But this wasn't my problem. I did wonder whether everything she'd told me was a lie. Perhaps there was no way out of the tower, and I would never escape this vile place. Nevertheless, I had to try, even if there was only the slimiest chance of freedom. I was a wreck by this point, my leg sliced open and the serpent's poison still spreading through my system. But I wouldn't give up, finding reserves that I never knew I had as I limped through the chamber, opened the next door, and practically crawled up another staircase to reach the final room, where I would be forced to face my personal demons head-on. As I pushed through the heavy door, I stumbled into a chamber straight out of my nightmares. Before me was a fierce inferno, a house burning against a dark horizon with bodies strewn across a grassy field, as bloodthirsty killers whooped and fired their rifles into the air in the foreground. I physically shook as I slowly walked forward across the wet grass, which had inexplicably appeared underneath my feet, and felt the heat from the flames against my skin. There were tears rolling down my cheeks as I walked in a daze towards the inferno, and an immense guilt ate away at me. Because you see, I'd been here before, back during my mortal existence and the seemingly endless war I'd fought in. The soldiers celebrating this vile atrocity were my former comrades, soldiers turned crazed killers, dancing in the heat of the fire they'd lit. And there was worse to come. I already knew what to expect, but the horrific scene I was forced to relive almost broke me. On the wet grass were 4 fresh bodies lying outside the burning house, each one showing the signs of multiple stab and bullet wounds as their innocent blood seeped into the dark soil. The children were the hardest to see, a boy and girl, both under the age of 10. I assumed they were brother and sister, once full of life and hope, but now lying dead in the dirt, their lifeless eyes staring up at the stars above. Their mother lay beside them, her dress ripped and breasts exposed. Her mouth was frozen in a horrifying death scream, and I knew she'd seen her children butchered before they finished her off. The last body was that of a white-haired elderly woman, all clad in black. Presumably, she was the children's grandmother, and she'd been shot through the heart. The final look etched on her wrinkled face was one of pained resignation. I turned away from the bodies in shame, looking with disgust upon my platoon mates who'd committed these murders and now celebrated their wickedness without remorse. I realized then why the tower was showing me this horror from my past. This atrocity was pure evil carried out by the hands of mortal men, and not even the deepest depths of hell could match what we'd done to one another on earth. I froze where I stood, my emotions overwhelming me as I sobbed uncontrollably and wished the ground would swallow me up. In a way, this is what happened, as the horrifying scene disappeared in front of my eyes. The burning house vanished, and the cheering soldiers were pulled into the darkness, and all that was left were the 4 bodies, except they were no longer the empty vessels of innocent souls. I could only watch in stunned horror as the dead rose, all 4 transformed into something vile and hateful, hissing zombies with ravenous eyes and gaping mouths. They advanced upon me with their hands extended like claws, apparently intent on gaining bloody revenge. For a moment, I considered letting them. After all I'd done, I surely deserved this. But no, I wouldn't give in to the tricks of the tower. I had to keep fighting. At this point, I could barely stand, let alone walk, as the pain from my injuries was nearly overwhelming. But somehow I summoned the strength to go on, limping towards the steel door at the far side of the chamber. I could hear the vengeful ghouls behind me, rambling along slowly but making good progress, as they snarled and hissed in spiteful anticipation. I didn't turn around as I shuffled across the cold metal floor, my whole body aching with every movement. I got within 10 yards of the door before I collapsed in exhaustion, no longer able to walk, and so reduced to crawling. The zombies were right on top of me now, grasping and clawing at my dragging legs as I desperately tried to kick them off. I felt helpless as they began to drag me backwards, and I was sure I was done for. But, to my immense surprise, the attack ended as abruptly as it had begun. I turned my head in astonishment, only to see the murdered family standing and watching me. They'd suddenly ended their murderous assault upon me, and their dead eyes were no longer filled with hate. Instead, I saw a deep sadness in the women and children as they looked down upon me. It was almost as if they pitied me. All I could do was make a wholly inadequate apology, mouthing, "I'm so sorry." With that, I turned my back on the victims and continued my slow retreat, finally reaching the door and pushing my way through to the other side. I stumbled in surprise, only just stopping myself from falling over the edge. Amazingly, I'd made it to the summit of the Iron Tower, surviving against all the odds. I suppose I should have been relieved to escape the dark and seemingly endless staircases and hellish chambers. But the world I emerged into was hardly an improvement. Instead of sunshine, I was faced with a blood-red sky, and the air was anything but fresh, as my nostrils were filled with the foul stench of death, decay, and burning flesh. My weary eyes slowly scanned downwards as I heard the distant cries and clashes of far-off battles. Several hundred feet below me was the doomed city of Dis. Hell's capital was seemingly infinite, as all I could see in every direction was crumbling buildings and military fortifications. There must have been hundreds of fires burning across the hellscape, and the city streets were full of broken and torn-up bodies. But most chilling of all were the huge, towering demons who stalked the streets, 60-foot-tall giants whose roars filled the rancid air as they literally stomped on any lost souls still foolish enough to be caught out in the open. These wicked minotaurs were Satan's elite troops, the core of his vile army tasked with crushing Minos's rebellion. I had seen one when I first arrived in Dis, but that demon was dispatched by a horde of bloodthirsty zombies fighting for the rebel army. But it seemed the tide had turned. Lucifer's foot soldiers now dominated the battlefield as dozens charged through the city, crushing and destroying everything in their path. I noticed how they were advancing towards a central point, which I realized was the pyramid-like structure where we'd been briefed before we were sent into battle. Satan's forces were surely gunning for Minos, and I reckoned his foolish rebellion would soon be over. But I didn't care about any of this. I was done. The pain overwhelmed me as I collapsed onto the cold metal balcony, the tower's spire above me and the burning city below. I'd been promised my freedom if I reached the summit, but it seemed this had been yet another lie. I was distraught and entirely beaten. I did consider throwing myself off the edge, but what would be the point of that? This was hell, and I couldn't die for a second time. It seemed there was no escape, and I was in fact doomed to an eternity of torture and suffering. But suddenly I spotted something in the corner of my eye. A winged creature descending from the crimson sky above. At first it was little more than a dot on the horizon, but the flying entity was coming ever closer and evidently heading straight for me. Didn't have the strength to fight or flee. Instead, I merely looked up to see my attacker. But to my surprise, I was temporarily blinded by an intense white light which emanated from the winged creature. I shielded my eyes as the entity landed with a heavy thump on the metal, just yards from where I sat. Fearfully, I raised my head to observe the interloper. I expected a harpy or winged demon, an ugly and fiendish beast from hell's legions. Instead, I cast my weary eyes upon something ferocious yet beautiful. Towering above me was a tall humanoid figure, easily 12 foot in height and clad in shining armor which covered her breasts and torso. I say she because the entity was definitely a woman, a stunning creature with long blonde hair and piercing blue eyes filled with strength but also compassion. She carried a mighty sword which would surely light up even the darkest of places, but she did not draw the weapon to threaten me. Instead, she spoke in a song-like voice which was both booming yet comforting at the same time. "Rest easy, my child, I mean you no harm." My jaw dropped as I struggled to speak through all my pain and shock. "What? Who are you?" I eventually muttered. I swore she shot me a smile through her ruby-red lips before responding. "I am Ariel, and I serve the one true Lord." I was in awe, not believing that something so beautiful could exist in a place so evil. Ariel was an angel, of course, but she was a long way from home. "Why are you here?" I asked sheepishly. "To observe," was her simple answer. "Look." She pointed her sword to the city below where an epic battle was about to occur. I could barely see him at first, but Minos used his great power to rapidly grow in size, and his body was soon the size of the demons charging towards him. He maintained the form of a bearded giant, but with a thick snake-like appendage wrapped around his immense body. The demons roared as they launched their assault with fiery swords in hand, but Minos remained calm, using this serpent tail to thrash out and strike the monsters. Several demons fell, their giant bodies collapsing and crushing the buildings beneath them. But the attackers kept on coming. Next, Minos used his dark powers to summon fire from thin air, propelling fireballs which consumed the advancing demons. Clearly, Minos was extremely powerful, but he was also heavily outnumbered, and soon began to falter under the relentless assaults. Then suddenly, the surviving demons stopped their attack, forming a circle to prevent Minos from escaping but not driving home their advantage. I didn't understand why at first, but then I saw it. Another huge, winged beast soared through hell's sky, but this creature was no angel. Quite the opposite, in fact. I froze upon witnessing the monstrosity, a gigantic dragon-colored jet black. The beast was easily the size of a bus, with a vast wingspan, burning red eyes, and a huge maw full of razor-sharp teeth. I had seen the monster before, shortly prior to my entrance to the Iron Tower, and I knew who he was. Lucifer, Satan, Lord of the Flies. The devil was here to deliver bloody vengeance upon the traitor. Minos looked up at the last possible moment and, even from a distance, I could see the terror in the giant's black eyes. The beast breathed fire, delivering a stream of white fire which hit Minos from above and set his exposed body alight. The giant cried out in agony as the dragon dived into him with its sharp talons exposed. Minos fought back with whatever strength he had left, using his tail to lash out at the beast. He managed to drive Lucifer back temporarily, but couldn't last for long. The Shambler in the Attic. Must you have battle in your heart forever, the bloody toil of combat? Old contender, will you not yield to the immortal gods? This nightmare cannot die, being eternal evil itself. The horror, pain, and chaos. There is no fighting it. No power can fight it. All that avails is flight. The Odyssey. Dear James, I write to inform you that your persistent inquiries into the Byron House incident have finally worn away the last threads of reticence I may have developed regarding its open discussion. I have warned you more than enough in my various replies over the past few years. But if you still desire to know the truth of what happened at that accursed house, on that accursed night, Read on. I urge you not to do so, however. Some things are best left buried in the past, or in this case, buried beneath the charred rubble and crumbled stone of that hideous edifice. I do not write this letter easily. Even now, the events surrounding that night create a panic that causes a cold dread to creep across my skin. To even briefly recall what I saw on that night, and of the measures I took to end it, causes my mind to unravel in terror at what vague horrors may still lurk beneath the bricks and mortar of that terrible place. Although my account is undoubtedly localized in its scope, it hints at a much larger gathering of nightmarish forces at work in the hidden, shadowed corners of the earth and beyond. The lurking unknown that lairs in the twisting vistas of the deepest cosmic spheres and the lightless chasms of the unnameable blackness of the outside. I have long since burned all my diary entries detailing Byron House and my subsequent correspondences with occultists, pseudoscientists, and fringe scholars from across the globe. All that remains is the very letter you now hold in your hands. Because I have destroyed all written record of what happened at the house, I am relying purely upon my memory to recount the shadowed details. The horrid truth is that I have forgotten much of it, and what remains feels like little more than the fevered hallucinations of an oversensitive and morbid imagination. It may be for the best that I struggle to remember the exact facts of the matter, a blessing for the both of us, in fact. I will now detail for you that terrible chain of events that led me to soak the attic room of Byron House in gasoline and burn the building down to cinders, free of all its occupants, save one. You may recall that I have always held an interest in the afflictions of the mind and a morbid fascination with those poor souls with which such illnesses hold enthralled. Well, in my younger years, before I became a doctor, and was still very much under the subjugation of academic studies, I took on the role of an orderly at Byron House. For me, then, the job was more than a way to pay my university fees, but a way for me to get close to that unseen world of lunacy and madness. Byron House had once been a home for the elderly, but was closed for unknown circumstance, only to be bought and reopened privately by one Dr. Samuel Monroe as a home for the mentally ill. I knew of the house long before I ever worked there. Everyone in Barton did, I think. In my childhood, it served perfectly as the quintessential haunted house for me and my small coterie of friends. Whereas they looked upon the building as a means of acquiring a cheap thrill, calling the staff and residents names before running away, I looked upon it with a chilling but irresistible dread. Even then, the macabre held me in its grip of fascination. It wasn't wraiths bound in chains or moaning specters that captivated my imagination. No, Byron's phantoms were bound in the crippled gray flesh of those elderly inhabitants. I would watch them, shambling around its gardens, waiting, perhaps even hoping, for death to swoop down and take them. I sat for hours, motionless behind a hedge, and watched their frail, brittle bodies wander around the wide lawns, seemingly unaware of the moribundity of their surroundings. I made a vow to myself one day that I would never allow old age to take me. I was determined that I would die relatively young and energetic, better to go suddenly in the throes of youth than slowly rot away within the walls of a tomb like Byron House. Time has passed, however, and I have failed to keep my vow. Many times I have considered taking my own life, but something has always pulled me back from the precipice of saturnine thoughts. I started my job as a fresh-faced, naive youth, eager to learn all I could from some honest hands-on experience. There were 12 inmates at the house, each laboring under a complex cocktail of mental disturbances and psychoses. The inmates were overseen and cared for by 8 staff members of various rank. At the very top there was Dr. Monroe, while at the bottom there were the orderlies like me. The conditions of the inmates ranged drastically, from hysteria, monomania, and psychopathy to feeble-mindedness and retardation. My fellow workers were likewise a mixed bag. One that really stood out was Williams, an ape of a man whose large frame was well suited to restraining rampaging inmates, as well as beating them on occasion, if the rumors about him were true. Another standout was Jane, a well-mannered but somewhat jaded divorcee approaching 50. Jane was part of the government's new nurse training program, and she was always on hand to offer advice regarding administering medication, but there was no warmth in her towards the inmates, and I often wondered why she chose this kind of career for herself. Then there was Dr. Monroe, a distant and stern figure. I got the impression that he in some way resented his position at the house, and he was rarely seen outside of his office. In addition to those three, there were several new starters, some students like me, and some more local strong-arms who were only good for lifting and carrying uncooperative inmates. I regret that I cannot remember any more names or faces, despite the impact it has had upon my life. My time at Byron House was mercifully brief. Now I said there were 12 inmates, and at first that is what I thought when I started my job. I quickly learned through staff gossip and whispered hearsay, however, that a 13th inmate was being treated at the house. A rare and special inmate, whose condition was so extreme that it demanded constant specialized care from Dr. Monroe personally. I eventually learned that this inmate's name was Jonathan Spencer. He was ominously nicknamed 13 by the staff, and he resided at the very top of the house in the attic space, which had been specially renovated to accommodate him. Unlike the other inmates who were permitted to occasionally visit their families, 13 never left the house. He never even left his attic room, and all the staff except for Dr. Monroe were forbidden from going to the top floor of the house. Jane once told me a story about a young girl who had come to work at the house several years ago as a porter. She had been working the graveyard shift, and Monroe was away on a rare occasion hosting a lecture at Manchester University, leaving her on her own. She had heard 13 banging around upstairs, and despite being told to never visit the top floor, she decided to go up to the attic to make sure everything was okay. Upon investigating, she had run screaming from the house into the night, never to return. After that time, Monroe became even more paranoid about exposing Spencer to the rest of the staff, and would often sleep over at the house in his office to ensure that a similar incident did not occur. Although she didn't like Monroe, Jane was happy that the grim man spent most of his time at the house. It meant that she didn't have to deal with 13 in any way. As far as she knew, Spencer had always lived in the attic, even before she came to work there, which had been a great deal longer than she cared to admit. Williams didn't have much to say on the matter. He seemed to think that 13's condition was more physical than mental, that it was his body that was deformed rather than his mind. Even though the man was large and not afraid of any of the other inmates, he would grow nervous when working the top floors of the house. Monroe was quick to inflict Williams upon unruly inmates, but as much of a lackey that he was, even he was not permitted near the attic. Between myself and the other orderlies, 13 was a source of constant gossip. None of us had ever seen or even heard him, and apart from that one singular horrifying moment in time that I endured, none of us would ever see him either. My own curiosity regarding the attic and its occupant grew by the day, but Monroe was protective, fanatically so, when it came to Spencer's care. Despite volunteering to help, the doctor would just brush aside my inquisitiveness with an annoyed wave of his hand. As fate would have it, I was permitted an entrance into that insane dark world where few among mankind have tread, and it happened sooner than I thought it would. It was December, and I had been working at the home for a little under 2 months when Jane came into the staff room one morning with a cup of coffee, a pack of cigarettes, and a look of pure vexation on her ashen face. I had never noticed that she smoked before that day, but she had been in the room no longer than a few seconds before she had lit up a slender white stick and slumped down in the chair opposite me. She didn't talk to me straight away, or even look at me. She just sat down, almost as if in shock, and drank from her coffee cup and took the occasional long, languid pull from her cigarette. I tried several times to ignore her and go back to reading an article that had caught my interest, but my gaze was always drawn back to her wide, unblinking eyes. "Okay," I said, folding the paper and slapping it down on the chair next to me. "What is it? What's wrong?" I had developed a casual friendship with Jane, despite her being my senior, and we often talked in a direct, no-nonsense manner. She finished her cigarette and immediately lit another before answering my questions. "I was on shift last night," she said quietly. "I was working the graveyard. I'm having to cover for a staff absence." "Oh, whose?" I sat up interested. "Monroe. He's got a virus and can't risk passing it on to any of the inmates, especially." She paused for a few seconds. 13? I prodded. She didn't say anything. She just nodded slowly. I didn't question anymore, as I could tell that whatever ordeal she had gone through the previous night, she wasn't keen on elaborating further. I sat for a few minutes and pondered. This was my chance, I thought. I had been curious about 13 for a while, and I had hoped to get involved in his care. With Monroe away and off sick, a window of opportunity had opened up before me. "So," I said, startling Jane out of her thoughts, "I take it you're having to work tonight too?" She grimly nodded with a sense of total defeat. "Well, I could always work instead. I don't mind. I've even asked Monroe a couple of times if I could assist with 13. You see, I'm writing a paper for college at the moment, and..." She cut me off and stood up out of her chair. "Really? You wouldn't mind? Are you sure?" "Of course," I replied. "Although Monroe has probably asked you to cover as you're the most senior member of staff. I'm not sure he would be pleased if he found out we had swapped shifts." She thought for a moment before replying, "Well, I won't tell him if you don't. I can pay you directly from my pay packet. No need to change the rota." I nodded in agreement. "It's settled then. You finish here early and I'll stay on to work the night shift. I may need to quickly go home and grab some things, but it won't take long. I live quite close." The relief that washed across her face was at once pleasant to see, yet also concerning, for I knew that should I go through with my offer, a good night's sleep would not be on the cards. She perked up considerably and continued to work for the rest of the day, planning to leave a little before 7 p.m. She was good enough to provide me with a list of chores I would need for the night shift, and I spent the rest of the day working my usual rounds. I don't think the impact of what I had offered to do had truly sunk in, and I remember feeling more excited than anything else. As the daylight hours gave way to the dark of the December evening, the rest of the staff left one by one, not too long after Jane had departed, and it was only then that the situation dawned on me. Williams shot me a cruel look on his way out that made me uneasy and left me to ponder if he knew more about what was in store for me than he had let on during his various digs and jibes made at me during the day shift. I had never worked the graveyard shift before. Others had, of course, and they had said that despite his unsociable nature, the presence of Dr. Monroe was always a reassuring one. At least having a normal person in the house with you was comforting, with the added bonus that, as a trained doctor, he could handle any situation that might arise from the myriad possibilities available. But as night crept on and the inmates were safely restrained in their rooms, I began to feel an oppressive cloak of loneliness wrap heavily around my shoulders. At 9 o'clock, I prepared medication and a light supper for Spencer, the details of which Jane had written down for me, along with instructions on how to offer them to him. The meal consisted of nothing more than a plate of scrambled eggs and some fresh orange juice with a straw. The medication, too, was simple: some pain relief, nutritional supplements, and allergy treatments. There was nothing in the medication that would suggest a psychosis or mood-stabilizing treatment was required for him. Whatever 13's disorder was, I thought, it was clear that it wasn't a mental ailment, but something physical that could not be cured, only treated. I wondered how much time the unlucky resident must have left, if indeed he was suffering from a physical disease, as I ascended the stairs with my tray in hand. I paused momentarily at the landing on the third floor and listened for any sound coming from the other inmates. After a few seconds, satisfied that there was no disturbance, I continued. This was the closest I had been to the attic since I started my job, and the thought of venturing upwards filled me with dread. I cleared my mind, however, and shook off my doubts away as I headed for the final set of steps that would bring me to the lonesome attic room. The stairs from the third floor led straight up and then curved slightly as they ascended upward and to the left. They grew narrower the higher I climbed, but the ceiling appeared to lower and grow cramped, giving me a distinct feeling of being boxed in. I stopped as the bend curved around more tightly and finally revealed the entrance to 13's room. I was maybe 10 steps away from the looming wooden door. It had been painted white some time ago, but large chalky flakes had fallen away, revealing the original oaken surface beneath. Just as Jane had described, a small flap had been crudely cut out of the bottom and nailed back on, and it was just wide enough to slide the tray under. The door seemed almost ethereal, as it stood alone and silent at the top of the staircase. It was something that I had only heard of in hushed whispers, but it now stood before me in all its horrid reality. I had moved no more than a single step towards the door, when I heard an excited movement coming from the other side. I say movement, but to be precise, the exact sequence of noises that followed gave the impression of awful, liquescent gesticulations. First, there came a soft thud, as if something had dropped from a small height. The noise was softly muted, as if whatever had landed had been cushioned by thick folds. I thought at the time that this was probably attributed to something like Spencer rolling out of his bed whilst wrapped in thick blankets. But there was a certain hinted wetness about the sound that baffled me. Secondly, and more repulsively, a low dragging sound followed by a labored breathing could be heard. It grew louder the longer I stood, but appeared to take a long time to get to the door. It was as if whatever mass inhabiting the room was closing in on my location with a deliberate, ghoulish lethargy. Horror took hold of my heart, but the rational in me demanded I maintain clear thinking. In a burst of what I can only describe as mad curiosity, I ascended the stairs and set down the tray at the bottom of the door. Then I pushed my body down flat against the stairs, so that my head was level with the half-inch gap between the floor and the bottom of the door. What greeted me on the other side will haunt me until the end of my days, for looking back at me was a set of bulbous, bloodshot eyes. I don't remember running down the stairs, but I do remember going into the ground floor bathroom and vomiting. A silly reaction, you might think, but there was something about those eyes that disturbed me to my very core. It may have been the odd spacing between them, or the way they had seemed to roll around sluggishly and loose in their sockets. For some reason I couldn't banish the thought of a toad or frog from my mind, as if my brain was struggling to conjure up the most obvious terrestrial comparison to the alien eyes that had glared back at me. I spent the rest of my shift in the staff room drinking coffee and waiting for the December sun to rise. When it finally did so, I packed up my things and waited for Jane and the other morning staff to relieve me of my duty. I said nothing to Jane as she approached me and asked how the night had gone. I think I managed a weak smile and a dismissive, "It was fine," before hurriedly leaving the premises and making my way home. As fortune would have it, my week on shift came to an end the very next day, and I spent some free time in total seclusion at my flat. I slept at lot but did not feel refreshed. I could not get those eyes out of my mind, and they continued to haunt me for days afterwards with restless, vivid dreams. When I did return to work a few days later, I confined myself to studying my coursework in the staff room as much as I could. No one bothered me, as I sat in deep concentration over various books and papers. Despite the distraction, I could not banish that awful night from my mind. Dr. Monroe was still off with a virus, so I assumed that the other staff had covered the night shifts during my week of respite. Nobody spoke of or reported any strange happenings or eventful encounters, however. Despite my shock, A morbid fascination was creeping over me. I felt I had seen something not only horrifying, but also enlightening, and my mind burned with the duality of horror and curiosity. My thoughts kept snapping back to those eyes. What terrible affliction could have caused such physical madness of form? If I could perhaps speak with Spencer, especially with Dr. Monroe, currently out of the picture, maybe I could make the unfortunate patient the focus of my academic work. At the very least, I could find some rational and mundane reason that would explain what I had seen that night. A few more days working my ordinary rounds, and my mind was made up. I approached Jane and stated clearly that whilst Monroe was off ill, I would like to personally take over her night shifts in the house, the same deal as before. Unsurprisingly, she was eager to facilitate my request without protest. My next shift began that very night, and I pondered my renewed focus as I prepared the medication and evening meal to take up to the attic. Again, it was a simple setup, some mashed potato and a milky cup of tea with straw. I looked distastefully at the pan of steaming mash and wondered if 13 ever grew tired of the sloppy menu Dr. Monroe had set down for him. All the meals were clearly designed for someone with only the most rudimentary of eating ability. It was more like the kind of food you would feed to a baby than a man. It was all soft puddings, mashed vegetables, and liquid nourishment. With a newly fortified resolve, I made my way back to the attic with my tray, this time without pausing. As I ascended that last set of stairs, something did indeed greet me at the door. It was not an object of terror or disgust, but rather an item that made me immediately question its validity as something that belonged to this exact time and place. It was a small piece of plain paper, a little crumpled and folded crudely several times, and it was sticking out from the gap at the bottom of the door. No sounds came from within the room beyond, and I assumed that 13 must be sleeping. I quietly slid my tray carefully through the flap, as to avoid disturbing the occupant behind the door, and collected the note and the breakfast tray left behind by the morning staff before creeping quietly back down to the staff room. I dared not read the note during the night, just in case its contents caused a disturbance in my mind that would affect my ability to continue working. I placed it into my satchel, noticing a strange, glistening semi-wetness on its surface, and tried to distract myself with some university work, occasionally glancing over at the bag and resisting the temptation to read Spencer's note. In the morning, I did a quick handover with the morning staff and sharply made my way back to my flat. Normally, I would go straight to bed and catch up on some sleep, but instead I put on a large pot of coffee and prepared some toast. Taking my breakfast and the note over to my study desk, I opened the blinds to allow the struggling December morning sun to break into the room, and then sat down and slowly unfolded the paper. Now I would be lying if I was to say that the writing on the note was anything more than childish scrawling, and at first I doubted there was anything of worth to be gleaned from the spidery scribblings. But after several minutes of study and copying words onto a fresh piece of paper, I managed to decipher enough of the contents to read. As I mentioned at the start of this account, I have long since destroyed all written documentation of these events, but I can recall enough of the note to tell you what Spencer had written. I may be embellishing the text slightly, for if you knew what I know, you would find an impossible juxtaposition between the writing and what had written it. As best as I can remember, it read roughly as follows. I apologize if I shocked you the other night or gave you a fright. Please don't feel guilty for finding my appearance shocking. I have long since grown accustomed to such reactions. I can only assume that Dr. Monroe, for whatever reason, is unavailable to look after my well-being, and it is on that assumption that I have seized upon the chance to finally have contact with someone else. I must apologize for my disgraceful and crude writing. My condition makes matters of delicacy difficult, so please be patient. I will not confuse you with the full knowledge at what is at work here, nor my condition or cause of confinement within this house. I freely admit that I do not know exactly where I am or how much time has passed since I first came to be here, but that isn't important anymore. Unless certain measures are taken care of, I will not be long for this world, and if that happens, it can only mean Monroe has achieved his grand aim. Understand this: the man you know as Dr. Samuel Monroe is not whom he appears to be. In our youth, we were close friends, the best of friends you could say, and together we adventured and traveled among all the forgotten corners and exotic places of the world: the Orient, the Congo, and Arabia. We explored the deepest jungles of the Indian subcontinent, the ancient sands of Egypt, and the forgotten ruins of the Americas. My condition is somewhat linked to these travels, but it is something far more sinister than a mere tropical disease. Now I need to have two things from you, if I may be so bold. I realize you are under no obligation to aid me, but know that if you do, you will not only be doing me a service, but also securing the future safety of all mankind. Firstly, I need you to keep our correspondence a secret. No one, least of all Monroe, must suspect we are in contact. That man is wicked and will seek to do you harm should he discover you have been talking with me. Secondly, I will need you to acquire some items that have been taken from me. Unfortunately, I believe them to be in Monroe's possession. I will tell you more about these once I have received a reply from you. Only then can we move things forward. I am thankful to whatever powers allowed our paths to cross and look forward to hearing from you. The note was fascinating. I reread it several times as my coffee and toast lay forgotten amidst the dozens of questions now burning through my mind. I could not be certain that it was even meant for me, but somehow I grew convinced that it was. The eloquence of the writing was in total contrast to the manner in which it was presented, but it clearly came from a vibrant and sharp mind. As intelligent as the author may have been, it was clear that Spencer was disturbed in some way. There was little doubt that the letter had cast a dark shadow over Dr. Monroe's conduct. Just what sort of wickedness was Spencer implicating the doctor in? True, the man was unfriendly, cold even, and more than a little abrupt. But would he really seek to cause me harm, should he find out I was in contact with Spencer? I simply could not give the idea credence. I was quite certain, at this point at least, that the whole affair regarding Spencer's dislike of Monroe was a delusional fantasy, conjured up by Spencer in the isolation of his attic confinement. After all, was it not only natural for someone with a mental disturbance to project a demonic persona upon those whom he saw as his jailer? Fantasy or not, I decided to follow the advice given to me and not alert Dr. Monroe to my contact with Spencer, if only out of a desire to keep my job as opposed to any kind of fear of physical harm. I wrote a reply that morning and took it up to Spencer when I started my next night shift. Suffice to say, I had agreed to hear him out, but only on the sole condition that he told me all he knew about his illness, so that I could use that knowledge to benefit medical science. Of course, what I was truly hoping for was a unique case to focus my academic studies and career around, and I'm sure on some level Spencer suspected that. Before sliding my reply under the door, I first attempted to make verbal contact. I pressed my head close against the door and simply said, "It's me. I got your note." No reply came. I continued with, "How did you know I would get it?" And, "Can you hear me?" My last question was cut off by a loath, bubbling, gurgling sound, a liquid response that brought bile up to my throat. I fled once more, almost as keenly as on that first night I saw those terrible eyes, and confined myself once again to the staff room, where a cold sweat prevented me from gaining any meaningful rest. Early the next morning, I rushed upstairs before the morning staff came in, and to my relief, there was another note waiting for me. This second letter was shorter than the first, and as I was more accustomed to his writing, I was able to quickly read over it before the day's staff arrived. Although shorter, This note was more revealing, and it opened the doorway to the chaotic madness which eventually followed. Overwhelmed to hear that you will aid me. I am a little unsure if you are ready for all that I have to say, but you must be, for my sake, but also for yours. Before that, though, I must address a few things. Last night I was unable to respond to your questions. I did try, but as you no doubt heard, my vocal skills have atrophied to the point of uselessness. I appreciate your keen interest in my condition. I am flattered that you would consider trying to offer treatment or a cure, but I am afraid I am far beyond that. Perhaps a bathe in the waters of Lake Hali in Carcosa, or the medicine of the star scientists of distant Yugath, might avail me, but mere terrestrial treatment is useless. My affliction is just that, a punishment handed down by callous forces that occasionally take an interest in our race. Never to our benefit and always to our misery. No, I am beyond help, but I thank you for the gesture. The items I mentioned in my last letter are as follows. My diary that I kept up until my imprisonment in a manuscript. The latter is of the most importance. Its title is De Vermis Mysterious. Both should be in Monroe's home. You must find a way to get both back to me here as quickly as you can. The next few days dragged on. I knew what Spencer wanted me to do, but I was undecided if I was capable of committing a crime to get him what he wanted. Clearly, he was delusional. There could be no doubt of that. But I was still so keen to learn more about him. Despite his words, I was sure his condition could benefit from study, and it was only the continued imprisonment by Dr. Monroe that stopped the medical community from offering him any kind of aid. I wasn't fully ready to burgle a man's home on the request of a madman, and besides, Dr. Monroe was still off work with a virus, making a midnight trip to his home a risky endeavor. I had no reason to call on him in a social capacity, and I doubted he would even recognize me as a work colleague. Such were the man's ways. I maintained a relaxed correspondence with Spencer, avoiding a direct answer to his request, and instead probing further into his and Dr. Monroe's past. Eventually he grew impatient, and our brief notes started to turn into bitter circular arguments. Spencer's illness appeared to worsen, and he was growing nervous. I was unwilling to rush headlong into a decision regarding recovering his notes and manuscript, and this provoked in him a string of notes filled with venomous scoldings. I admit that during this time I considered dropping the matter entirely and returning to my previous routine of university work, and considered quitting Byron House altogether. Before deciding one way or the other, however, I took it upon myself to do some research without telling Spencer. I didn't have a lot to go on, but I made a trip into the nearby town of Eastwich and consulted the modest library there. I searched for anything that mentioned a Lake Hali, Carcosa, Yugoth, De Vermis Mysterious, and all the other nonsense words that had appeared in Spencer's notes. Of Lake Hali and Yugoth there was nothing. No text on geography, history, science, astronomy, or any other subject known to man contained a reference to either of these words. De Vermis Mysterious was a more successful area of study, and I learned a great deal about this forbidden and cursed tome. It was written in the year 1542 by one Ludwig Prynne, shortly before his death at the hands of the Inquisition. Various translations and copies had been made throughout history, many with strange titles such as The Grimoire or The Saracenic Rituals. Its original Latin title, however, was ominous, translating into something akin to The Mysteries of the Worm. The book seemed to be one of several interconnected volumes, each more hideous in subject matter and scope. Other works were mentioned in the text, books such as Culte de Ghoul, Things of the Water, and that final and most dreadful work of black magic, the Necronomicon. Each book spoke of strange places and strange times, whole cycles of myth, where the earth had been ruled over by old ones and elder things, of the malevolent fungi from Yugoth, of the faceless night gaunts, and of the black goat with 1,000 young. of great Cthulhu, who lay dead, but dreaming in lightless, brine-soaked Relia. I freely admit that most of the works were mercifully beyond my understanding, but still there was an awful sincerity to their descriptions. I pushed such thoughts from my mind. After all, I was at that time a man of science, not sorcery. Still, they lingered in my imagination and have continued to do so every day since. After hours of searching, I also came across a small paragraph in a recently written history book about witchcraft regarding the reign of Queen Elizabeth I that mentioned a certain John Dee as a sorcerer and author of such works as Monas Hieroglyphica and Notes on the Mysteries of the Worm. I made a note of the book's author, a Dr. Harlan Glass, and penned a letter to him the next day, asking if he knew anything about a book called De Vermis Mysteries, but I never received a reply. What kind of forbidden study had Spencer and Monroe been involved in? I had always assumed the doctor to be a rational man, but if Spencer were to be believed, he has once a keen scholar of the supernatural, an explorer of strange, dark places. The day in the library had taxed my mind, and I returned to my flat for an early night's sleep. My dreams, however, were far from restful. I was plagued by a reoccurring nightmare of the first time I had seen Spencer's strange eyes. Chaotic vortices burned into my mind, and I found myself floating through the vast void of space. I knew not how I came to be in the ether, but I had a vague sense of possessing no body, and of being carried on the back of something so sinister I dared not look. The beating of huge wings deafened my ears, and although I had no idea where in space I was, I instinctively knew I was bound for lightless Yugoth, the outpost of the dread sentient fungi. Then my nightmare scene shifted, and I found myself standing at the edge of what I knew must be Lake Halley in Carcosa, dark purple waters lapping languidly around my ankles, thick like syrup but with the stench of 1,000 rotting corpses. Something huge and horrifying rotated slowly in the center of the lake, a colossal tower of plastic flesh that to my horror possessed the mockery of a face upon its surface, and eyes too, the swollen, bulging eyes of Spencer. I awoke suddenly, screaming and short of breath. My sheets were damp with cooling sweat and my head throbbed in pain. I took a week off work to recover, but the nightmares continued to assault me on a nightly basis. Eventually, December came to a close, and Christmas came and went with little fuss. I've never been one to overly celebrate the so-called festive period and spend most of my time alone in my flat or in the local pub. When I did finally return to Byron House, I discovered that Dr. Monroe had also returned to work and was looking a lot healthier, having finally beaten the virus, and he was back to his usual, aloof self. I was somewhat relieved, as his presence made contact with Spencer impossible and beyond my control, something even he would be forced to accept, as it seemed he was as afraid of Monroe discovering our contact as I was. I wasted little time. By now, I had become obsessed with gaining more knowledge about De Vermis Mysterious and its contents. I didn't for one second believe that anything I had seen in my dreams or read in various books on necromancy and witchcraft to be true, but rather, I saw it as a means of further understanding more about Spencer. My desire to write a paper on him had been renewed by my sudden plunge into his supernatural interests, and I felt confident I could write a groundbreaking work on supernatural monomania and hand it in confidently to my tutor. I had finally decided to go ahead with Spencer's wish and steal back his diary and manuscript. Not to hand over to him, of course, but for my own personal study. Once I was done, I could simply sell the book and make a bit of cash in the process. By all accounts, it would be worth a fortune to the right buyer. I knew my time at Byron House was coming to an end. First semester exams were looming, and I would need to quit my job in order to focus on my studies. In a few weeks, I would be away from Monroe and Spencer and back into the sanity of regular student life. Greedy for knowledge, I therefore decided that breaking the law was worth the risk and set about planning my theft. I started to follow Monroe home on my days off. Despite recovering from his illness, he seldom stayed the night over at Byron House. No doubt he was still recovering on some level and wished to sleep in his own bed. This would make things difficult, of course, but I was confident his stubbornness would cause him to quickly lapse back into his old habits. I would wait for him just out of sight and then carefully shadow the man until I became familiar with his routine. Fortunately, he did as I suspected he would and started spending more time at Byron House. Eventually, I chose a night to break into his home. It was a freezing January night when I made my way over to Monroe's large detached house on Town Court Lane. The night was clear and painfully chilling, and the moon and stars were shining down brightly from the void above, momentarily bringing back memories of my recent nightmares. I won't make too much of an ordeal about my burglary, and I'm certainly not proud of it. Despite being a total amateur, I managed to scale the large brick wall at the back of the residence, and using my jacket wrapped around my hand, punched my way through a small glass plate fitted into the kitchen door. Wasting no time, I pulled out my pocket torch and systematically searched the downstairs rooms. It wasn't long before I came upon a study. There was a strong musk permeating the whole room, which I attributed to the stuffed animals and ancient tomes that littered the walls. Hundreds of large, heavy books were held up by sagging shelves that almost seemed to creak and moan under the weight. I searched the largest of the bookshelves, trying my best to find the tome I needed. The books were in no order and heaped upon each other in a haphazard fashion. Among the mundane volumes on history, anthropology, and geography, there sat several dark and sinister texts that I had seen mentioned in my time at the Eastwich Library. There was Unaussprechlichen Kulten of von Junst, Conte der Letz Kult de Ghoul, and the dreaded Saleno fragments. Most of these forbidden texts appeared to be modern translations, but at least one of was frighteningly authentic and ancient. It didn't take me long to find De Vermi Mysterious. I slid the crumbling manuscript out of the shelf carefully, the remaining books gently toppled into the vacant space it left behind. I doubted if Monroe would even notice a particular volume missing in all this chaotic cataloging, but I quickly rearranged the shelf, so no noticeable gaps were present. I noticed another, slimmer black-bound volume tied to the back of manuscript, and a quick check confirmed this to be Spencer's diary. I silently praised Monroe's sense of propriety. Despite his disorderly collection, he must have known how important Spencer's diary and notes on the manuscript were. Unable to contain my curiosity, I opened De Vermis Mysteries and glanced over the spidery text inside. Unfortunately, the manuscript was far too complex to decipher, with its archaic Latin, and so I concentrated instead on the more accessible, but no less mysterious journal. I was confident that Monroe would not return home, and the house had no close neighbors. So by the light of my pocket torch, I sat at the study's large desk and read. The journal detailed the various travels that Monroe and Spencer had undertaken as young men, and it appeared that the latter had been true to his word in his note describing these adventures. The diary spoke of an ancient cult that the two had come into contact with during their sojourn in Central Asia, a place, or perhaps even a time, known only as Leng. It also spoke of a secret order of undying monks who guarded a fabulous treasure that lay in the center of a great stone monastery. This treasure, a large golden idol of a winged hound, was a powerful artifact, capable of opening the way for the old ones locked beyond our reality. They guarded this treasure from all would-be thieves, such as the fearsome Cho-Cho, a race of semi-human cannibals, as well as the dreaded spiders of Leng, sentient arachnids with their own designs for mankind. The old ones appeared to be Monroe's main motivation concerning the cult. In particular, he appeared to be opposed to them in some way. Spencer seemed much more interested in the cult's mysterious powers. As I read on, I learned more about their dealings with the monks and the secrets of immortality that they could induct outsiders into. It seemed that Spencer did indeed get his wish and meet the deathless leaders of the group, but that the meeting had gone sour, and in retaliation, he decided to steal the golden idol and make his escape. Monroe was reluctant to go with him, but being guilty by association, was forced to flee for his life. During the trip back to England, the two had been in constant disagreement as to the idol's fate. Monroe wanted to be rid of the thing, but Spencer refused, saying that the black secrets contained within would allow them to live forever, as gods upon the earth. At some point the two parted ways, Monroe with the idol and Spencer with nothing. He grew deeply paranoid and furious with Monroe's departure, and became convinced that either the cult or Monroe had placed a curse on him, and spoke first of the symptoms that no doubt manifested into his current condition. I tried my best to locate the idol, which was drawn on a diary page with great detail, but my efforts were fruitless. I suspected that Monroe may still possess it, but that it must have been hidden somewhere in his house, or even his office at Byron. Regardless, it was time for me to leave. I didn't sleep well after reading Spencer's diary. The nightmares grew more vivid and intense. I felt as if I was being plunged into gloomy Erebus, my tormented soul nightly assaulted by every blasphemous revelation that the diary had revealed. The morning I was due to attend my last shift at Byron House, I sat and pondered over an untouched cup of coffee. I had read much in the past few weeks, and although I was certain that the whole matter of magic and old gods and Yuggoth was purely fanciful, I couldn't detach a dreadful sense of realness from the topics I had read. If everything written down in that diary was true, then it would appear that Monroe had put a stop to Spencer's plans of immortality and locked him up in the attic to cease whatever menace he may have been to mankind. Due to my nightmares, however, I was quickly growing tired with the whole affair. It was taxing my mind to breaking point, and my studies had suffered because of it. I reasoned that if some insane inmate wanted his books back, who was I to deny him? Better to be rid of the things and banish all thoughts of elder gods and old ones from my mind and get back into my studies, forget about the whole thing and my involvement in it. Secretly, I had thought about putting the books back in Monroe's house, but it had been clear that he knew about the burglary due to the smashed window I left behind. He seemed to be spending more time at home now, and I heard a rumor that he had acquired a rather large German shepherd to guard his home. Having possession of the books would clearly mark my guilt. On the off chance he suspected me, the local police would not have to search my tiny flat long to find them. I could have discarded them, but that felt irresponsible, given their contents. Plus, my fingerprints would be all over them. Selling them was an option, and my original plan, but I pondered upon what kind of person would be interested in obtaining the book, and to what purpose. Plus, they could still be traced back to me. You may think I was being paranoid, but at the time I did not want to risk the chance, no matter how unlikely, that I could be linked to criminal activity. I snuck the manuscript and Spencer's diary into one of my folders and went to work. At the earliest opportunity, when the other staff were busy and there was a lull in activity, I marched up to the attic, and after a moment's hesitation, I placed both the diary and the De Vermis Mysteries in front of the door and knocked once before briskly leaving. I worked sporadically at Byron House from then on. I had planned to quit, but a few extra shifts came my way, and I was in no position to turn down the money. I found a way to juggle the work with my studies, and I took day shifts only. Slowly, the nightmares stopped, and I was able to get adequate rest. I looked forward to passing my exams and starting a new semester at university, and it felt as if normality was returning to my life. However, I noticed a strange change in Monroe as the days went by. He was showing signs of severe stress and appeared to be growing weaker as time passed. The virus that had plagued him a few weeks ago appeared to be back, and I even saw him cough up a small measure of blood into his handkerchief. His entire demeanor took on a somber appearance. Great black rings formed around his eyes, and deep wrinkles appeared to be manifesting upon his brow. Not only did he come across as a man ravaged by illness, but also a man worried out of his mind. He was less abrasive than usual, and even attempted to make some light conversation with the other staff in an almost resigned and defeated way. Eventually, he got so ill that he once again had to leave work, only this time he never came back. We received the news a few days later that Dr. Monroe had died of heart failure, nothing unusual given his age and recent stress, but still it unnerved me greatly. His death plagued my mind, for if what I dared suspect was true, then I had somehow played a part in his death, and so had Spencer with that damned manuscript. Now, James, we are coming to the end of my story. It has taken a while to get to this point, and I admit that I may have stretched out the affair longer than I intended. If I have, it is only because I dread writing that which must be written down. It is the only way you will understand. As I did at the start of this account, I now urge you to consider not involving yourself any further in this matter. Put the occult and witchcraft far to the back of your mind. There are things mankind cannot know. Black magic is truly the devil's work, James. If you are so inclined, you can do your own research on the history of Byron House. If you do so, you will learn that one February evening around 60 years ago, the house was burned down to its foundations, with only one casualty. You may also learn, too, that not long after, Dr. Monroe's house was broken into, and a large portion of his private book collection burned to ashes on his back lawn. No one was ever caught for these crimes. There were suspects, of course, disgruntled ex-employees, former inmates, perhaps even a naive and young orderly studying psychiatry at the University of Manchester. But the police failed to ever nail down a perpetrator. I am an old man now, and my mind is not as sharp as it once was. Nevertheless, I will recount the horror as full as I can, and maybe then you will give up this investigation of yours. Once a month, the staff and inmates at Byron took a trip into the countryside as a reward for good behavior, so that everyone could benefit from some good old-fashioned fresh air. Spencer was exempt from these trips, of course, due to his physical limitations, and would have normally stayed behind with Dr. Monroe, whilst the rest of the house went out. However, with Monroe gone, none of the staff were willing to stay behind to see to Spencer's needs, and instead a tray of food was to be left outside of his attic door. The staff and inmates then left the house for a few days. I had made it clear that my college studies needed some serious tending too, and I would be unable to work at Byron House any longer. I left not long after Dr. Monroe passed away, and never stayed in contact with Jane, Williams, or anyone else from the house. Confident that one of the fellows I now shared my student accommodation with in Manchester could provide me with an alibi should I have need of one, I took the train from Piccadilly to Eastwich. I then took the last bus to Barton, and I waited for Williams, Jane, and the various inmates they looked after to leave the premises and allow me to make a concealed entry. It was with a heavy heart and a troubled mind that I once again ascended those lonely, sinister steps that led to the attic. By this time, the nightmares had returned, only now they featured the tormented spirit of Monroe, crying to me from beyond the grave. I admit to you fully that I may have been in the grip of madness myself at this time, for what sane man would have done what I did on that chill February night? I was convinced that the fate of all mankind was at stake, that Leng and Yugoth and Carcosa were all very much real, and that the old ones waited patiently in their ancient prisons to descend once more upon the earth. I cannot say to you that I do not still believe these things, but that is my burden, not yours. As I summed up all the courage I could muster and stood before the door, a voice slurred forth from beyond. To this day I cannot say if I truly heard these words, or if they just appeared in my mind, but those liquid syllables, slimy and slopping, spoke to me, and I dared not answer back. You, done well, The key mine. Monroe denied. Killed him. Called it down from the stars. Ritual. Soul is nectar to the gods. It fed of him. Elder ones feast now. Monroe burns. Body returning. Freedom. Your help. You're next. My head spun with confusion and my heart pounded with fear. In one mad burst of fury, I kicked down the door and gazed upon that which had once been Jonathan Spencer. What did I see? It's difficult to truly describe with justifiable detail. But what I did see caused me to flee the attic in a fit of howling madness and return with petrol and matches. Whatever it was, I was convinced that only the purifying touch of fire could erase its horrid monstrosity from the world. For floundering on the attic floor there laid a vast mass of gelatinous, rotting fungoid flesh, quivering under the weight of its own hideousness. Parts of it lay splashed upon the ceiling and the walls, but the bulk laid upon the bare attic floor in bubbling pools. Unblinking, bulbous eyes rolled around the shuddering mound before locking upon me with the intensity of a dying star. Appendages and pseudo-appendages formed and spurted up from within, only to collapse into mounds of hideous protoplasmic tissue that continued to squirm of their own accord. I think I saw a face, or at least the parts of a face, crawling somewhere upon the surface of that blasphemous bulk. It was a rancid thing that had labored under the curse of Leng for more than half a century. A blob of squirming meat that was the laughing, gibbering, mocking form of Jonathan Spencer, inmate number 13, the shambler in the attic,